Tonight, I want to tell you about a civilization that built an empire spanning thousands of worlds, wielded technology that bent the very fabric of spacetime, and then vanished so completely that for tens of thousands of years, the galaxy forgot they had ever existed at all. It is a story I keep coming back to because it raises a question that troubles me. What does it mean for an entire people to be erased from history, not by conquest or catastrophe alone, but by time itself? The civilization I'm speaking of is called the Rakata, and they are perhaps the greatest mystery in galactic archaeology. Not because we know nothing about them, but because of what the fragments we do know suggest about what we have lost. Across 100 worlds scattered from the known galaxy to its rim, explorers and scholars have found the same strange markers, monumental structures that predate any known civilization by tens of thousands of years, technology so advanced that we still do not fully understand it, and warnings, actual carved warnings, that someone wanted desperately for future powers to read and heed. The Rakata built what they called the Infinite Empire, and at its height, roughly 30,000 years before the rebellion, it stretched across more territory than any single government has ever conquered before or since. They enslaved hundreds of species, from humans dragged into bondage to the Wookiees of Kashyyyk, whose anguish and resistance would echo through the centuries. They built monuments of impossible scale, created weapons that could reshape star systems, and at their core, they constructed something called the Star Forge, a machine so vast and so terrible that it became the stuff of myth, whispered about in university halls and forbidden archives long after the Rakata themselves had turned to dust. But here is what makes their story not merely a tale of rise and fall, but something stranger. The Rakata did not simply lose a war, or grow weak, or gradually fade into irrelevance. They were struck down by something that should have been survivable, something that broke them in a way that made survival almost meaningless. A plague swept through their worlds, and I want you to hold this detail close, because it is essential to understanding what happened next. This plague did not merely kill them. It severed them from the Force itself, the fundamental energy that bound their technology, their power, their entire civilization together. Imagine being a people whose mastery of technology is not separate from your soul, but inseparable from it, where every ship, every weapon, every device that holds your empire together requires not just the hands of an engineer, but the will of someone attuned to the deepest currents of reality. Then imagine that connection simply being cut. It would be as if a musician woke one morning to find that sound itself no longer answered to them, as if a builder found their hands no longer remembered how to shape stone. That is what happened to the Rakata. In a single catastrophe, their greatest strength became useless. Their hyperdrives, which had carried them across the galaxy, no longer functioned. Their weapons, which had conquered worlds, fell silent. Their Star Forge, that monstrous engine of creation at the heart of their civilization, simply stopped. And in the vacuum left behind, thousands of enslaved worlds rose up at once. The Rakata, suddenly robbed of the tools that had made them invincible, could not suppress a rebellion of that scale. Their empire did not fall to a greater power or a cunning strategist. It fell because the thing that made them Rakata at their deepest level was taken from them. What happened after is perhaps even more haunting than the collapse itself. The surviving Rakata retreated to their homeworld, Lehon, far out in the unknown regions where the rest of the galaxy could not easily reach them. But they did not rebuild, and they did not persist as a civilization might be expected to persist. Instead, they fragmented into tribal factions, forgot the scope of what they had once been, lost the knowledge of their own history. From the greatest power the galaxy had known, they devolved into scattered bands engaged in primitive warfare, no longer even aware of the ruins they walked among or what those ruins meant. It is one of the most complete erasures in recorded history, not the immediate destruction of a people, but something slower and in some ways more absolute, the forgetting of themselves. Yet they left traces. Deliberately, it seems, they left traces. Across Kashyyyk and Tatooine, on Manaan and Korriban, on Dantooine, and in dozens of places we are still discovering, the Rakata left behind fragments of their knowledge. Star maps carved into stone, technology that refused to decay, warnings that persisted even when the language shifted, and the worlds changed hands again and again. For 25,000 years, those warnings sat in the darkness, waiting for someone to find them and understand. When explorers finally did begin to piece together what these ruins meant, they realized they were looking at the remains of the first true galactic empire, built not by the Jedi or the Sith or any government in recorded history, but by a people so ancient that they had become legend. And as scholars began to decipher the fragments, to translate the warnings, to follow the star maps back to their source, they began to understand something else. The Rakata had wanted future civilizations to know what happened. They had left warnings, and somewhere in those warnings, encoded in stone and in the empty star forge drifting in the dark, there was a message about what it costs to build an empire and what empires eventually pay. This is the beginning of that story, not in the ancient past where the Rakata rose, but here in the present, in university libraries and excavation sites, where fragments are still being found and still being understood. The Rakata may have vanished, but they are not gone. They haunt our knowledge in the form of ruins, mysteries, and the terrible cautionary tale written in the rise and fall of the infinite empire. So let us begin at the beginning, long ago, before the plague and the fall, when the Rakata were still at their height and still believed they would rule forever. On the world they called Lehon, in a region of space that would later be known as the Unknown Regions, something remarkable was beginning to stir roughly 100,000 years before the Republic would even be imagined into being. The Rakata who lived there were not yet the architects of an empire. They were, in those earliest days, simply a people learning what they were capable of. They were force-sensitive in their very blood, every cell resonant with what we now understand to be a profound attunement to that vast, living energy that moves through all things. Their physiology was distinctive. Tough, leathery skin that could withstand the extremes of their world, large eyes that saw in ways we might not quite be able to comprehend, bodies built for a kind of amphibious grace in the warm waters and humid air of their homeworld. But what made them remarkable was not their appearance, it was the clarity of their connection. Most species, across all of galactic history, have members who touch the Force, individuals gifted and rare and precious for it. The Rakata were different. Their entire civilization was suffused with Force sensitivity as a birthright. There is something worth pausing on in that fact, because it shaped everything that followed. To be born Rakata was to grow up knowing, in the most fundamental way, that you were attuned to the deepest current running through reality. Imagine if your entire species inherited what other species spend lifetimes searching to understand. Imagine the confidence that would build, generation upon generation. Imagine, too, the danger in it. What emerged from this foundation was a philosophy of mastery that felt, to the Rakata themselves, less like ambition and more like destiny. They began to study the Force not as mystics or seekers, but as engineers study mathematics, as a system to be understood, mapped, harnessed, and ultimately controlled. And they possessed, from the beginning, a gift for technology that seems almost to have been wired into their thinking. They could look at the marriage of machinery and force, at the way dark side energy could be shaped and channeled and made to do practical work, and they understood it intuitively in a way that would not come easily to other species, even if they tried for millennia. Their first great breakthrough was the development of hyperspace navigation, but not the way it would eventually be understood by later civilizations. Later ships of the Republic and beyond, would navigate using mechanical calculations, star charts, astromech guidance. Rakata navigators did something stranger and more profound, and in its way more terrible. They learned to feel the concentrations of life across the galaxy, the way the Force pooled and gathered around populated worlds, and they taught their ships to follow that invisible map. Their hyperdrive technology was not separate from their Force ability. It was woven through with it. Only those Rakata who were strong in the Force could navigate, which meant that from the very start, Force sensitivity became inseparable from power, from access, from the ability to move and trade and shape the galaxy around you. This was not accidental. This was by design. The Rakata did not see this as a limitation. They saw it as confirmation of the natural order of things. If you could feel the Force strongly enough to navigate the stars, then clearly you were meant to do so. If you were not able to, well, there was a reason for that too. This reasoning, this absolute certainty in their own superiority, would eventually become the philosophy that justified everything that came after. Around them, as their ships began to venture outward, they discovered a galaxy full of other species, most of them blind to the Force or only dimly aware of it, most of them bound to single worlds or small regions of space. The Rakata looked at these beings and saw not equals, but resources. They saw potential, yes, but not moral potential. Potential for labor, for building, for serving a greater purpose. And there is something important to understand about how the Rakata framed this in their own minds. They did not believe they were doing something wrong. They believed, with perfect sincerity, that they were bringing order to a chaotic galaxy, that they were elevating lesser species by incorporating them into something greater than themselves, that the hierarchy they were establishing was natural and right, and even, in some sense, merciful. This is the peculiar thing about absolute certainty. It makes almost any action justifiable. When you know without doubt that you are superior, that your way is right, that your species is destined to lead, then kindness itself becomes a kind of condescension, a gift that requires no reciprocation but gratitude. So the Rakata began to expand outward from Lehon with what they would have called purpose, and what history would eventually call conquest. Their ships, guided by Force-sensitive navigators who read the stars like a map written in living light, began to map the galaxy methodically, world by world. On Tatooine, a desert world orbiting twin stars, they found the Cumunga, a silicon-based species, and put them to work. On Kashyyyk, they found the Wookiees, magnificent in their strength and skill, and enslaved them to labor in service of grander plans. On Manaan, they encountered the Selkath in their underwater cities and drew them into the machinery of Rakatan dominion. On Coruscant, a world that would, in another era, become the jeweled heart of a republic, they found early humans and subjugated them without hesitation. Each conquest was another confirmation that the Rakata were right, that they had understood something fundamental about the galaxy that other species had not, that destiny was simply playing out as it should. And with each world brought under their control, the Rakata grew more unified in their philosophy, more convinced of their vision, more capable of executing it. They built monuments to themselves and their achievements, great structures that would stand for millennia, repositories of knowledge, seats of power. They began to forge what they called the Infinite Empire, a network of dominion stretching across thousands of worlds, all connected to Lehon at the center, all feeding resources and tribute back to the Rakata core. There is a moment, I think, in the arc of any civilization's rise, where the question of whether they should do something gets drowned out by the fact that they can. The Rakata had reached that moment. They possessed the technology, the Force ability, the philosophical justification, the ambition, and the will to reshape the galaxy according to their vision. What they did not yet possess was any doubt that this was the right thing to do. That, as it turned out, would come later, when it was far too late to change course. But in these earliest centuries of their expansion, in the first flowering of what would become the Infinite Empire, the Rakata were united in purpose, certain in their righteousness, and intoxicated by the power of finally being able to fully express what they had always believed they were meant to be. The galaxy did not know it yet, but it was entering the age of the architects, and nothing would ever quite be the same. Imagine for a moment what it must have felt like, to stand at the edge of a great turning when the weight of your own certainty still felt like destiny. The Rakata had learned, by the middle of the 50,000-year mark before the Republic would form, that the galaxy was not a wilderness to be feared, but a canvas waiting for their hand. Their ships moved through hyperspace guided by something no other species could replicate: the ability to feel in the deep channels of their consciousness, where life gathered most thickly across the stars. A world dense with living things, bright with life force, sang out to them like a beacon. And they answered. On Dantooine, in a clearing that would one day shelter a Jedi enclave, they left a monument, a star map, they called it, inscribed with mathematical precision and encoded with something deeper, something that resonated with the Force itself. It was a record of dominion. These are the worlds we have claimed. These are the routes by which you may return to us. This is the shape of our reach. They built not out of mere conquest, you understand, but out of an almost missionary conviction that they were bringing order where chaos had reigned. The Kashyyyk Wookiees, a proud species, powerful in their own way, had built their own civilization in the shadow forests of their homeworld before the Rakata arrived. They did not surrender willingly. But the Rakata did not need their willing surrender, only their labor, their strength, their resources, given or taken, to feed the engine of expansion. Across Korriban, across Manaan, where the Selkath tended their oceans, across world after world, the pattern repeated. A Rakata ship descended from the stars. Envoys came first, sometimes offering the choice: join the infinite empire, accept the rule of the master species, and receive the gifts of advanced civilization. Many refused. They all fell. There is something, I think, that we often miss when we look back at ancient empire building: the certainty of the builders themselves. The Rakata did not experience themselves as tyrants. They experienced themselves as architects, literally and philosophically. They possessed technology so far beyond what other species could imagine that it must have seemed to them not like superior force, but like destiny itself, the natural order asserting itself. Their hyperdrives ran on something the enslaved species could never touch: the Force, that invisible current of power that flowed through them as naturally as blood. To someone who could feel it, command it, draw energy from it, the gap between themselves and everyone else was not a matter of degree, but of kind. It was biological. It was spiritual. It was, in their own understanding, simply the way the galaxy worked. The Star Forge was constructed, over centuries, as the beating heart of this vision. A massive station, built around the twin stars of their home system, designed not just to build weapons and ships, but to do so on a scale that made supply lines almost irrelevant. Stellar energy, raw and inexhaustible, fed into the forge and came out as warships, fighters, droids, tools of conquest. A production so vast that no other species could match it, had ever matched it, could ever hope to match it. And the forge was not neutral technology. It did not simply convert energy the way a machine might. It was soaked through, saturated, powered by the dark side of the Force, the same dark side that flowed through Rakata blood and consciousness. The Forge did what the Rakata asked, because the Rakata themselves were part of its operating mechanism. There is something that feels almost intimate about that, in a deeply unsettling way. The technology and the builders not as separate things, but as extensions of one another. The Rakata poured their will into the machinery, and the machinery amplified it back to them, and together they reached out to grasp the galaxy. By this point in their history, 50,000 years before the Republic, still what seems like an age of youth for their civilization, they had laid claim to hundreds of worlds. They had established trade routes and labor hierarchies and systems of control that would persist, in some form, for tens of thousands of years after they themselves had vanished. They had left monuments everywhere, not just star maps, though those were the most important, but structures, temples, remnants of presence that declared, to anyone who might come later, "We were here, we were great, we shaped this place." They built not just to control, but to be remembered. On Lehon itself, in the heart of their power, their cities rose. Not crude fortifications, but structures of genuine architecture, temples and administrative centers and laboratories where they refined their dark side techniques, their force-channeling mastery, their understanding of how to weaponize the invisible current that moved through all living things. And yet, even in the midst of all this expansion, in the moment when their reach was greatest and their confidence most complete, I wonder whether anyone among them sensed what would later prove inevitable, that this dream, magnificent as it was, contained within itself the seeds of its own dissolution. The very unity that made them so formidable, the single-minded certainty that bound them together, would one day become a fracture point. The technology that made them unstoppable depended on something they could not regulate, could not fully understand, only channel and command. The enslaved worlds they brought into their empire would not remain docile forever. But that is a story for later. For now, in this moment, 50,000 years before the Republic, at the very height of the architect's dream, we should sit with what they had accomplished, with the sheer scope and audacity of it. They had looked at a chaotic, divided galaxy, and they had said, "This will be ours, this will be ordered, this will serve a purpose." And they had made it true. The monuments they left behind still stand, in ruins, silent for millennia, waiting for someone to find them and piece together the truth of what the Rakata had been. That is all that would remain in the end, stone and steel and silence. At the height of the infinite empire, 30,000 years before the Republic would even exist, the Rakata had become something few galactic powers ever truly achieve. They had made their supremacy so absolute that it had begun to feel inevitable, like a law of nature rather than a fact that could be otherwise. Across the galaxy, in stations and colonies scattered from the outer rim to the galactic core, Rakatan administrators moved through their days with the quiet confidence of people whose assumptions had never once been challenged. The trade routes that connected the vast web of the Empire, the paths through hyperspace that required a force-sensitive navigator to sense safe passage through the stars, flowed inward toward Lehon, and nothing moved without Rakatan approval. On Kashyyyk, the Wookiees labored in the forests where the Rakata had claimed them generations ago, their physical strength conscripted into service, their natural world reshaped to feed the appetite of an empire they could neither resist nor truly comprehend. On Korriban, a world of ancient red deserts far in the outer rim, the Rakata constructed temples and observation posts, imposing their will on a landscape that would later become something else entirely, though no one could have foreseen that. On Tatooine, on Honoga, on Dantooine, and 1,000 other worlds whose names would survive in fragments and fragments only, the same pattern repeated. Rakatan conquest, Rakatan control, the subjugation of the local species into servitude. They left monuments on these worlds, great star maps carved into stone and set into vaults, records of their dominion laid down like a hand pressed into wet clay, meant to guide Rakatan travelers home and to remind the conquered of who held their destiny. What strikes me, sitting with the weight of all this, is how complete their control had become, and how that completeness itself might have been the thing that blinded them to any suggestion that it could ever be otherwise. The Star Forge hung in space near Lehon, an enormous station that had become less a simple weapon and more the arterial heart of the entire empire, drawing power from the nearby star and channeling it through the dark side of the Force into an endless production of warships, droids, and weapons. What emerged from the Star Forge was not built in the way most species built things, measured, deliberate, with calculation and engineering spreadsheets and committees. The station simply manufactured what the Empire needed, in quantities so vast that the eye could scarcely track them. To operate the Star Forge required something that only the Rakata possessed in abundance. Force sensitivity woven so deeply into their biology that it was indistinguishable from what they were. A gift so fundamental it had begun to seem like earned superiority rather than fortunate circumstance of birth. The same was true of their hyperdrives, their starships, even their computational systems. All of it required a force-sensitive operator. And in a galaxy where the Rakata were the only species with that combination of natural ability and civilizational will to develop such technology, that meant the Rakata alone could travel, could command, could truly move through the stars. What this created, over centuries, was a cascade of reinforcement. The Rakata controlled hyperspace because they were force-sensitive. They controlled trade because they controlled hyperspace. They controlled conquest because they controlled trade. And with each conquest, they enslaved a new species to dig minerals and grow food and build monuments to the rightness of Rakatan order. The other species within the infinite empire, and there were thousands of worlds, billions of individuals under Rakatan rule, existed in a kind of structured eclipse, able to perceive the light of authority, but not to reach toward it, not even really to imagine what it would mean to do so. I think about the architecture of that moment a great deal. The sheer weight of assumption stacked into every layer of Rakatan society, the way supremacy had calcified into something that felt not like power, but like physics. On Lehon, the Rakata built cities that rose from the landscape like stone dreams, structures that merged their understanding of the dark side with engineering and aesthetics into something that existed nowhere else in the known galaxy. The force flowed differently on Lehon. It was thicker there, heavier with intention and the accumulated will of a species that had bent its entire civilization toward the mastery of that power. Rakatan children were born knowing they would command worlds. Rakatan scholars spent their lives elaborating the philosophical justifications for why this was not tyranny, but destiny, why the enslaved species should understand themselves as fortunate to serve the will of a civilization so far advanced in understanding. The dark side of the Force in their hands had become not a path to excess or madness, or so they believed, but a tool of governance, a language in which they spoke the will of the strong to the weak, and the weak, when they had been broken sufficiently, began to speak it back. I find myself thinking about the moment before a great height, that instant when everything is aligned and functioning, when all the pieces are in their places, when the edifice seems eternal and inevitable. The Rakata at their zenith existed in that moment, and the terrible thing is that they could not have known it was a height at all. They did not understand themselves as being at the peak of something. They understood themselves as being at the beginning of something that would simply continue forward, as the infinite empire was infinite and would not end. Control of the known galaxy had become so thorough, so embedded in every system and structure, that the possibility of losing it did not register as a serious consideration. The way a person who has walked every day of their life does not sit down and think about the possibility that they might one day forget how to balance. And perhaps that is the truest form of supremacy, when the powerful become so certain of their power that they stop being able to imagine its loss. The Rakata had reached that point 30,000 years before the Republic would emerge and slowly build its own certainties, its own monuments, its own elaborate justifications for why it alone should hold the stars. I want to pause for a moment here in the story and ask you to imagine something, because what happens next requires you to hold two truths in your mind at once, and I find that harder to do the older I get. 25,000 years before the founding of the Galactic Republic, at roughly the same moment that the Jedi Order was beginning to take its first formal shape in the galaxy's young heart, there existed another civilization entirely, one that had been ancient when the Rakata were still learning to read the currents of hyperspace. The Celestials, as later scholars came to call them, the architects, the ones who moved worlds. What I'm about to tell you is fragmented, pulled from ruins and whispers, and the kind of speculative scholarship that sits always at the edge of certainty. But the evidence suggests something remarkable. A species so fundamentally different in their approach to collective life that they may have solved, or thought they had solved, the problem that would eventually destroy them. Imagine a civilization where consciousness itself becomes a technology. Not in the sense of control or coercion, but something closer to consent, to willing unity, to minds that chose to think together. There is a parallel in the galaxy's later history. The Killiks, an insectoid species whose hive consciousness would emerge millennia after these events, whose individual members would lose themselves entirely in the collective will, their identities subsumed into the nest. But the Celestials' architecture of unified thought seems to have been something different, something more deliberately constructed, more philosophical than biological. It was governance, a symphony rather than tyranny. What we know is fragmentary. The Celestials built megastructures that still defy comprehension, even when examined with modern technology. They moved planets. They engineered star systems. The 5 worlds of the Corellian system, Corellia, Celonia, Drawl, Talus, and Trallus, the 5 brothers as they would later be called, were arranged in their orbital dance by celestial hands, a precision of planetary engineering that would not be attempted again for nearly 20,000 years. They created the Centerpoint Station, a construct of such staggering capability that it could thread entire worlds through hyperspace itself, bending the very rules of physics that govern faster-than-light travel. And near Kessel, in the cluster of black holes now called the Maw, evidence suggests they engineered that very formation, a region of space so treacherous, so theoretically impossible that some scholars believe it could only ever be an artifact, a deliberate reshaping of reality. A civilization that could do these things was not small. It was not young. It was old beyond the measure of most species' understanding, and at the heart of its apparent success was something we might call, if we are generous and careful with our language, an experiment in harmony. The Celestials seem to have developed governance structures built on collective consciousness, a unified framework where individual will and the common good were not opposed to each other, but understood as expressions of the same thing. I know how that sounds to you, I think. In our stories, we are suspicious of unity, and rightly so. Too often unity is another word for erasure. But I am asking you to sit with the possibility that they believed what they were building was different, that they had found a way for individuals to remain whole while thinking as one. There is something deeply appealing in that vision, and something in the appeal that makes me uneasy. Across their sphere of influence, which seems to have stretched across vast reaches of the galaxy in the eras before the Rakata rose to prominence, they maintained a kind of peace that we might call unnatural in its completeness. No internal wars recorded, no schisms documented, no evidence of the kind of civil strife that would typically fragment any empire so large and so long-enduring. When the Rakata encountered them, those force-sensitive warriors whose conviction in mastery was absolute, they found something they had not expected, not weakness, but difference. The Celestials did not defend their worlds the way the Rakata would have, with fleets and dark-side fury and the conviction of their own supremacy. They seem to have offered instead a choice, to join the collective consciousness, to think with them, to be absorbed into their vast and patient unity. And here is where the fracture appears. The Rakata, who had been taught from birth that their power came from their individuality, their mastery, their singular will imposed upon the galaxy, rejected this entirely. To them, the celestial offer was a kind of invasion, a theft of self, even if it was offered gently. Where the Celestials saw harmony, the Rakata saw submission. Where they offered unity, the Rakata heard erasure. And perhaps they were not entirely wrong to fear it. What begins as a choice in one generation can become an expectation in the next, and an expectation can harden into law. The psychological architecture of a hive-mind civilization, no matter how benevolent its origins, does not leave much room for the person who wants to think alone. So when the Rakata refused, when they turned away from the Celestials' vision and insisted instead on their own mastery, on the power that flowed through them from the dark side of the Force itself, there was a kind of inevitability to what followed. The Celestials, unified and stable though they were, lacked the hunger that the Rakata possessed. They did not expand with the same ferocity because expansion, for them, was not about dominion. It was about welcome, about invitation. The Rakata had no such hesitation. They took what the Celestials had built and they twisted it to their own purposes. They enslaved the species that the Celestials had merely visited. They fortified the worlds the Celestials had carefully engineered and turned those feats of collaborative creation into monuments of dominion. And slowly, region by region, the Rakata's infinite empire replaced the Celestials' quieter networks of harmony with networks of force. It is not a simple story of good and evil, which is perhaps why I return to it so often. The Rakata's conviction that they were bringing order was genuine, their power was real, their technology was breathtaking. But there was a cost to displacing the Celestials, and a cost to choosing mastery over harmony, even if no one understood that yet. The Celestials did not simply vanish, though records of them would eventually blur into legend and myth across the epochs that followed. What happened to them? What choice they made when their experiment in unified consciousness encountered the Rakata's fury? That is a question that will haunt this entire story. But for now, as the Rakata reach the height of their confidence, as the star forge spins in the black above Lehon and the Empire spreads its tendrils across thousands of worlds, we might pause and consider what was lost when harmony yielded to mastery. Not because harmony was perfect, nothing so unified is ever truly perfect, but because some things, once abandoned, are very difficult to return to. And the Rakata, in their absolute conviction that they alone understood strength, may have sacrificed something they did not yet know they needed. There is a moment, I find myself thinking often, where a unified thing begins to notice the cracks in its own foundation, and that noticing itself becomes the first real fissure. The Rakata at the height of their power, and they were powerful, genuinely so, in a way that would not be matched for tens of thousands of years, believed their unity was unbreakable. They had built the infinite empire on a philosophy as much as on technology, that they alone understood the Force's true nature, that mastery was not cruelty but destiny, that the galaxy needed their order. But philosophy is a living thing, and living things can change their shape when no one is watching. 30,000 years before the Republic was even a whisper in anyone's imagination, the first quiet questions began to surface among the Rakata. Not rebellion, not yet. These were philosophers, not soldiers, but a slow recognition that not all of them believed the same things about what they were building. Some of the Rakata scholars, looking at the vast network of enslaved worlds, the star forge's endless churning, the monuments they left on conquered planets like signatures of ownership, began to ask whether this was truly the only way. Others looked at the Celestials, those quieter architects who had built the galaxy itself through harmony rather than conquest, and wondered if there was something in that alternative vision they had been too proud to see. The Celestials had offered unity through voluntary consciousness, a joining of minds without the erasure of self. The Rakata had rejected it, certain that mastery through the Force was purer, stronger, destined. But 20,000 years before the Republic, some of the younger Rakata had begun to wonder if destiny and domination were truly the same thing. The first real schism was not loud. It was a fracture that ran through philosophy seminars on Lehon, through quiet conversations between Force-sensitive scholars in the great knowledge temples. One faction, we might call them the traditionalists, held firm to the old vision. The Rakata were the galaxy's natural rulers, The Force had chosen them, and slavery was simply the price of order. Another faction, smaller but growing, began to ask, what if the Force was not a tool of mastery, but a principle of balance? What if their role was not to dominate, but to guide? And what if guidance without consent was no guidance at all? There was a third perspective too, one that emerged from the military and the engineers. A pragmatic concern that expansion could only continue so far before it collapsed under its own weight. The Star Forge was magnificent, yes, but it consumed resources at a staggering rate. Each new conquered world required a garrison, required oversight, required the Force-sensitive Rakata to spread themselves thinner across an empire that was now so vast that communication itself, even through Force bonds, was becoming difficult. A Rakata general named Keleth, whose records survive in fragments, posed a question that would echo forward. Are we building an empire or a prison? He was not arguing against expansion, in principle. He was asking whether they had expanded so far that they could no longer maintain what they had built. It is a remarkably practical concern, and you hear in it the first notes of genuine anxiety. The traditionalists dismissed these worries, or claimed they did. They believed the Force itself would sustain them, that mastery had no limit because the Force had no limit. They pointed to the Star Forge and said, as long as this stands, as long as our pilots can feel the Force in hyperspace, as long as our weapons answer to our will, we cannot fall. But there was a brittleness in that certainty now, a quality that comes when power has to keep reassuring itself that it is power. What worried me most, and I do mean that genuinely, because I find myself thinking about this moment across history, was that none of these factions were wrong. The traditionalists were right that the Rakata had built something unprecedented. Their Force mastery was real, and their technological achievements were genuinely staggering. The philosophers questioning their methods were right that slavery corrupts the enslaver as much as the enslaved, that you cannot build a just civilization on injustice and simply hope the foundation holds. And Keleth and the pragmatists were right that empires expand until they cannot hold what they have conquered. All of this could be true at the same time, and that is perhaps the cruelest part of this story, that the Rakata were wise enough at this point to recognize their own contradictions, but not wise enough yet to change course. The schism remained mostly internal for a long time, philosophical rather than political, abstract rather than violent. The Rakata were not, for all their flaws, a species prone to sudden upheaval. Their unity, even in disagreement, held because they genuinely had been taught from birth that togetherness was strength. But the questions had been asked now, and they could not be unasked. In the great knowledge temples of Lehon, younger scholars began gathering separately from their elders, debating whether the infinite empire truly served the Force or had enslaved it. On the colonial worlds, Force-sensitive overseers began to notice that some of them administered their territories with a lighter hand than others, that mercy and mastery might not be incompatible after all. And in the military academies, officers like Keleth began training in a different philosophy, not how to dominate more efficiently, but how to hold what you had. The Rakata civilization had been unified in its purpose for so long that it had never developed the structures to tolerate disagreement, to absorb dissent and remain whole. That would, I think, prove to be the deepest flaw of all, not that they disagreed, but that they had no language for disagreeing without it becoming a kind of betrayal. There is something almost tragic in watching a civilization discover its own philosophical fault lines, and know, in some dim way, that acknowledging them might be the beginning of the end. But acknowledgement came too slowly, and it was too little, and by the time the Rakata understood what was happening, the cracks had already begun to run too deep. The unity that had built an empire was splintering into something that would soon tear it apart. Somewhere in the archives of Lehon, in those deep temples where the eldest keepers of philosophy met to discourse on the Force's will, a young scholar named Velkish posed a question that should have been heresy, but was not quite, not yet. He asked, what if mastery and slavery were not the same as serving the Force, but rather a way of refusing it? It is difficult now, I think, to understand how radical this seemed to people for whom absolute unity had been the only structure they had ever known. The Rakata had conquered because they felt called to conquer, had enslaved because the Force itself seemed to flow through their dominion like water, finding its course. To suggest that the Force might want something different, that perhaps it did not want mastery at all, but balance or surrender or some other arrangement entirely, was to suggest that everything they had built was not destiny but choice, and choices could be wrong. Velkish was not silenced, which itself tells you something about how fractured the unity had already become. Instead, his question found others who had been asking it quietly in the dark. On Korriban, where the Rakata had built temples to amplify the dark side's power, some priests began to wonder if amplification was the same as understanding. On Kashyyyk, overseers watching the Wookiees work themselves to exhaustion began to question whether a species that needed to be enslaved was truly lesser, or whether the need for slavery said something else entirely about the masters. These were not the thoughts of rebels, not yet. They were the thoughts of people within a unified system, beginning to experience it as unbearable. But into this fermenting doubt came another voice, colder and clearer than the rest. His name was Kelkarath, and he was not a philosopher but a general, a commander of the Star Forge's fleets, and he had spent centuries watching the Rakata pour resources into the maintenance of 1,000 worlds they did not need. He understood what Velkish and his circle were circling around, but could not quite articulate, and he named it plainly. The infinite empire was already infinite, and infinity cannot expand. To Kelkarath, the philosophy that had driven the Rakata's rise, that mastery was destiny, that the Force flowed through their dominion, had become a cage. The Rakata had spent so much effort conquering that they had forgotten why, and now they spent even more effort holding what they had conquered, a labor that seemed to grow heavier each generation. He believed the solution was not less domination, but more focused domination. Why hold 1,000 worlds weakly when they could hold 100 worlds absolutely, strip them entirely, and use that concentration of power and resource to become something more than Rakata altogether? This was not a return to the old philosophy of mastery as destiny. This was something harder and colder, mastery as will, the deliberate choice to take what you wanted and discard the rest. And it found an audience that the philosopher's doubts never could. Military commanders, tired of infinite garrison duties, listened to Kelkarath's words. Younger officers with ambitions that the Rakata's collective hierarchy could never satisfy heard in him permission to want more than unity allowed. On the research stations, where Rakata scientists worked to refine the Star Forge and unlock deeper applications of dark side technology, there were those who saw in Kelkarath's vision the possibility of innovation unshackled from collective consensus. The dissidents, as historians would later call them, were not organized at first as a faction, but as a silence, a growing collection of Rakata who simply ceased to participate fully in the collective consciousness that had always bound them. That silence was itself a form of violence. The Rakata's unity had never required explicit agreement. It was woven into them at the biological and spiritual level. To withdraw from it, even partially, was not merely disagreement. It was something like a limb choosing to stop receiving nerve signals from the body, and the body feeling that severance as pain. For the first time in their history, Lehon itself became a place of fracture. The great cities that had once thrummed with unified purpose began to feel the strain of internal division. Factions within the government, some aligned with Velkish's philosophical rebellion, others with Kelkarath's vision of focused dominion, started to operate with less transparency, to hold separate councils, to make decisions without waiting for the full collective consensus that governance had always required. The more the collective tried to reassert its authority, the more the dissidents withdrew, and the more they withdrew, the more the collective felt threatened. It is a pattern I have seen repeat across many civilizations in different eras, and it never resolves itself gracefully. Desperation makes unified systems even more desperate for unity, which makes the fractures deeper. What strikes me, thinking about this period, is that both sides were in some way right. The philosophers who questioned whether slavery served the force were not wrong. They were asking a genuine moral question that a truly just civilization would have grappled with openly and painfully. Kel'Karath was not wrong that the Rakata were spreading themselves too thin, that their resources were strained, that something needed to change. But neither side knew how to have that conversation within the structure they had inherited. The collective consciousness that had made the Rakata powerful for 100,000 years had no architecture for genuine internal debate. There was unity or there was fracture, and fracture felt like betrayal. So instead of reform, there was escalation. Instead of dialogue, there was separation. And in that separation, a question crystallized that would haunt the Rakata from this moment forward. If they were not united, what were they? And if they ceased to be unified, would they still be Rakata at all? By 18,000 years before the Republic, the dissident faction was no longer hidden. Kel'Karath had made his position explicit, had claimed a section of the Star Forge and its surrounding fleets, and had declared that a new vision of Rakata strength was not merely possible, but necessary. He did not yet call it a break. The language for schism did not yet exist in their civilization. But everyone understood that the unthinkable had begun. The Rakata had fractured, and there was no mechanism in their history to put them back together. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Vel'Kish and Kel'Karath had found each other before the rift became irreversible, if the philosophers' moral doubts and the generals' pragmatic grievances had somehow fused into a genuine movement for change, rather than into two opposing visions of the future. But that would have required a kind of humility neither the dissident faction nor the collective was prepared to offer. And so the stage was set for something neither of them truly wanted, but both seemed determined to create. War. Tonight, we turn to the moment when the Rakata civilization fractured from within, when the unified consciousness that had never known genuine disagreement suddenly found itself capable of something it had never been, at war with itself. The break had not come suddenly, you understand. It had been building for centuries, a hairline crack in the mirror that only now was beginning to spider outward across the whole of their culture. Kel'Karath, the general we spoke of before, had by the year 15,000 before the Republic taken direct command of the military production installations orbiting Lehon, and he had not relinquished them. What had begun as a pragmatic argument about resource allocation, about whether an empire could sensibly continue expanding when maintaining its existing territories, was already consuming more than their networks could bear, had become something harder to name and far more divisive. The Star Forge itself, that incomprehensible mechanism of dark side machinery that had always been the unquestionable engine of Rakata power, had become an object of genuine contention. Kel'Karath wanted control of its output concentrated in the hands of proven military commanders. Vel'Kish's circle, the philosophers and scholars, wanted its production constrained until they could better understand what the Force itself actually demanded of them. There was a theological argument underneath the military one, and there was a question of power underneath the theology. And here is what makes this moment so strange to contemplate. The Rakata had never developed the cultural or governmental structures to absorb disagreement of this kind. For nearly 100,000 years, they had moved as one entity, not through coercion, but through a biological unity so profound it seemed to them simply the natural order of thought itself. Their civilization had never needed to imagine itself fracturing, and it had therefore never developed the wisdom to survive it. The philosopher Vel'Kish began, quietly at first, to gather followers from among the younger scholars and certain of the more spiritually oriented Force practitioners. Those who had come to believe that the Infinite Empire's endless consumption of other worlds was not an expression of the Force's will, but rather a betrayal of it. They did not call it rebellion, they called it restoration. Kelkarath, watching this happen, understood what it meant, that the machinery of unified command was breaking apart, and that whoever moved first would shape what came next. In the year 15,000 before the Republic, he ceased to ask permission for his orders, and began instead to issue them as commands that the rest of the Rakata civilization would either obey or defy. The moment of that choice, when a general stops asking, is the moment a government dies, even if the machinery of it continues operating for a time afterward. Velkish did not defy him outright, not at first. Instead, the philosophical circle withdrew further from the collective consciousness that had always been the binding tissue of Rakata thought, the shared mental architecture through which all Rakata had always been able to feel the presence and intention of all other Rakata. To sever yourself from that, even partially, was considered almost incomprehensible. It was like refusing to use your own mind. But they did it, and the withdrawal was felt across the entire civilization like a rupture. Imagine, if you will, a species that has never known solitude suddenly becoming aware that some of them were choosing it, that they were placing themselves beyond reach, beyond communion, beyond the fundamental unity that gave life itself meaning. It was not anger that followed, not immediately, but something deeper and more destabilizing, confusion, and then a kind of desperate grasping to re-establish the broken connections. And when that grasping failed, when it became clear that Velkish's followers would not return to the collective mind, the confusion hardened into something else entirely. The first actual violence broke out not on Lehon itself, but in the colonial territories, in the vast network of conquered worlds that the Rakata ruled through a combination of Force enslavement and the threat of their impossible fleets. Fleet stations turned on each other, outposts declared for one faction or the other. The unified command structure that had held the Infinite Empire together began to dissolve into something resembling command structures, plural, contradictory, at odds. Kelkarath's faction, the Pragmatists, controlled more of the immediate military apparatus, more of the ships and weapon systems, and the critical mechanisms of the Star Forge itself. But Velkish's followers held something that turned out to matter more than mere numbers. They held the knowledge of how the deepest systems worked, the Force meditative practices by which the Rakata had always understood their technology not as machinery, but as extensions of their own will. The Rakata had never written down, in any mechanical or data storage sense, the true secrets of their own power. Those secrets lived in the communion of minds, in the shared consciousness that all Rakata participated in from the moment of their birth. And now that communion was broken. Those secrets were no longer accessible in the way they had always been. Both sides, as the conflict escalated, discovered that they could operate their systems less effectively than they had before, not because the systems themselves had changed, but because the unified understanding that had always undergirded them was gone. I find myself thinking about this a lot, how civilizations often contain the seeds of their own collapse not in their enemies, but in the very mechanisms that made them powerful in the first place. The Rakata's strength came from unity, from a biological and spiritual coherence that allowed them to operate with a kind of perfect efficiency that no faction-divided species could hope to match. But that same unity was so absolute, so totalizing, that any fracture in it was catastrophic, not damaging like a normal civil disagreement, but transformative, the breaking of a thing that had never been designed to break at all. By 15,000 years before the Republic, the Infinite Empire was at war with itself, and neither side yet understood that this war was not a thing to be won or lost, but a wound from which their entire civilization would gradually bleed. The question of which faction was right, whether mastery or restraint, whether Kelkarath's pragmatic consolidation or Velkish's spiritual questioning, would never be resolved because both sides would be consumed by the very act of asking it. And in the wider galaxy, across those 1,000 enslaved worlds that had seemed so securely bound, something else was beginning to shift. A watching, a waiting, a slow realization among the conquered species that the hand that held them in bondage had begun, just barely, to tremble. At 14,000 years before the Republic, the Rakata stood at the precipice of something neither side fully understood they were building. Not just weapons, but omens written into the fabric of spacetime itself. The schism that had fractured their unified consciousness could not be healed through philosophy or negotiation, because both sides had already begun to weaponize the very source of their power, the dark side of the Force itself. Kelkarath's faction, controlling the Star Forge and its military apparatus, understood a simple and terrible calculus. If consciousness could be fragmented, then consciousness itself could be amplified, weaponized, made to scream across light years as a force of pure dominion. They began refinements to the Star Forge that the unified Rakata had never dared attempt, pushing the station to feed not merely on stellar energy and the dark emotions of its operators, but on suffering itself, the anguish of enslaved populations, the despair of conquered worlds. The Star Forge, which had always hungered, grew fatter on this diet, and in growing, it became something even its creators could not fully control, a beast of appetite that demanded ever more fuel to sustain its endless manufacture of fleets. Meanwhile, Velkish's philosophical circle, severed from the collective consciousness and desperate to match Kelkarath's military advantage, pursued a different path. They began to study technologies their ancestors had left dormant since the earliest Rakata contact with the Celestials, weapons designed to unravel the fabric of worlds themselves. These were not ships, and they were not merely engines of destruction in any conventional sense. They were tools of systemic unmakings, capable of unstitching a star system's coherence, of turning planets inside out, of leaving behind not rubble but absence, as if entire stellar regions had been erased from the universe's memory. I find myself struggling to articulate what it means to weaponize that kind of power, to reach for something so catastrophic that the word weapon begins to feel insufficient, almost naive. The first deployment came not with fanfare, but with silence, which is perhaps the most chilling detail in the fragmentary records that survive. A system loyal to Velkish's faction was surrounded by Kelkarath's fleet, blockaded, starved of supplies and hope, its enslaved populations beginning to suffer the kind of attrition that warfare brings when one side holds all advantage. Rather than yield, Velkish's circle activated what the archives call a stellar disordering device. And what happened next was not an explosion in any conventional sense. The system's primary star was not destroyed. Instead, its internal coherence was disrupted, its fusion layers inverted, its output transformed into a cascading wave of exotic radiation that tore through space in directions that radiation should not travel. Ships in the surrounding system, both Kelkarath's and civilian vessels, because by then the distinction between military and civilian had begun to blur, were not merely destroyed, but unmade at a fundamental level, their molecular structures scattered across dimensions the weapons operators did not fully comprehend. The affected system became, within hours, uninhabitable in any meaningful sense, not destroyed, but transformed into something that violated the natural order in ways that made later observers question whether the weapon's effects had rippled into the future itself, into historical records, into the very memory of what had occurred there. Kelkarath's response was to weaponize the Star Forge in ways that pushed even the station's inhuman hunger beyond anything previously attempted. Where Velkish's circle had sought to unmake the coherence of stellar systems, Kelkarath's faction drove the Star Forge to produce a ship of such magnitude and such concentrated dark side amplification that it functioned less as a vessel and more as a mobile singularity, a weapon that consumed worlds not by unmaking them, but by absorbing them, pulling entire populations and planetary masses into its superstructure, adding their matter and their suffering directly to its reserves of power. The deployment of this ship, history calls it the Ravager, though that name came much later, after the original Rakata words for it had been lost, left behind not ruins but voids, regions of space where planets should have been but were not, where the star itself seemed diminished, drained, as if something fundamental had been stolen from the universe's foundational order. And here is what haunts me about this escalation. Both sides understood, I think, that they had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, that they were no longer fighting for dominion, but for the right to decide what remained when the dust finally settled. The weapons kept coming, each one more desperate and more catastrophic than the last, each one leaving scars on the galaxy that would persist for tens of thousands of years, scars that archaeologists would find in the current era and struggle even then to comprehend. The more that gravitational anomaly in the outer rim is believed by some scholars to be an artifact of these weapon deployments, a lingering wound in spacetime where something so fundamental was violated that the universe's geometry never quite healed correctly. Some worlds in these disputed regions were subjected to weapons so strange that their effects remained ambiguous even in the historical record. Planets that became crystalline and lifeless, stellar regions where time seemed to flow at different rates, moons that hung in orbit in configurations that defied gravitational stability, as if held in place by something other than natural law. What I find most unsettling about these accounts, though, is not the weapons themselves, but what they reveal about the Rakata's relationship to their own power. The unified civilization had wielded the dark side with conviction, true, but within a framework. They enslaved worlds in the name of order, expanded in the name of destiny, maintained dominance in the name of bringing structure to chaos. But the weaponized dark side, divorced from any unifying philosophy, was something altogether darker and more nakedly self-consuming. It was power reaching for power's sake, appetite feeding appetite, the very source of their strength turning inward and devouring itself. Neither side, I suspect, truly wanted these weapons to exist in the way that a person might understand want. They were compelled toward them by the logic of competition and the fear of annihilation. Trapped in an escalation, neither could escape, and neither, ultimately, could survive. By the end of this era, entire sectors of the galaxy bore the marks of these conflicts. Dead worlds, sterile systems, regions of space, where navigating by the Force itself became dangerous, because the dark side energies were so tangled and corrupted that a Force-sensitive pilot could lose their bearing entirely, could fall into madness, could become lost in the emotional and spiritual wreckage left behind by the weapons' detonations. The Rakata, who had once moved through the galaxy with absolute certainty that they were bringing order to chaos, now inhabited a chaos of their own making, and the enslaved populations who had suffered under their dominion began, for the first time, to see a possibility that had seemed impossible before, that their masters were not invincible, that the grip holding them could weaken, that something other than Rakata supremacy might be possible. That realization, I think, was the real weapon, not the devices that unmade stellar systems, but the simple understanding that empire, even one wielded by beings of extraordinary power, was not inevitable, not permanent, not the only possible future. By 12,000 years before the Republic, the Rakata Civil War had reached a point of such bitter exhaustion that even victory no longer felt like victory. And so Kelkarath's faction, dominant now but weakened, turned their gaze outward to the enslaved worlds and asked themselves a question that should have terrified them. Where would they find the resources to sustain the war machine they had become? The answer, in a civilization that had built itself on subjugation, seemed obvious and terrible at once. They would take more. Across 500 worlds that the infinite empire claimed as its own, the grip of the Rakata had always been absolute, but also, in some way, restrained by the sheer mathematics of it. You could enslave a species, work them, extract what you needed, but you still required enough of them alive to labor tomorrow. Now, as the Rakata tore themselves apart with their own weapons, that restraint evaporated. The orders came down from Lehon, from Kelkarath's generals and the Star Forge's corrupted machine minds. Extract everything. Take what you need today, and worry less about what remains for tomorrow. On Kashyyyk, where the Wookiees had been enslaved for thousands of years, the quotas for timber and processed materials doubled, then doubled again. The great Rosha trees, which took generations to grow, were felled without replanting. What had once been a forest world became a landscape of stumps and exploitation. The Wookiees themselves worked until they collapsed, their families separated deliberately to prevent organized resistance, their culture and language deliberately fractured by those who understood that an enslaved people united by memory is a people plotting rebellion. On Tatooine, already half-glassed from the ancient Rakatan bombardment that had turned it toward desert, the mining operations that the Rakata had established intensified with inhuman cruelty. Kumonga ancestors and other enslaved populations were worked to exhaustion in the deep mines, digging for resources the Rakata needed, rare minerals that powered their weapons, metals that the Star Forge would transmute into the next iteration of the Ravager. The heat, the collapse of the cave systems, the simple mathematics of working people to death in service of a war machine. These were no longer regrettable side effects, but accepted costs, budgeted for and planned around. You sent 20,000 into the mines. If 8,000 returned, that was acceptable attrition. The Rakata, who had once seen themselves as the inevitable masters of a chaotic galaxy, were now the architects of systematic obliteration. And here is something I find myself thinking about in the darkness. They did not do this from malice alone, though malice was certainly present. They did this from fear. A civilization fracturing along its deepest lines, unable to trust even the collective consciousness that had bound them for 100,000 years, does not grow merciful, it grows desperate. Kelkarath's faction needed resources to maintain their hold on the Star Forge, to fuel the fleets that patrolled the Empire's edges, to produce the weapons that kept their own rivals at bay and the enslaved populations from rising. So they reached deeper into the well, and the well began to run dry. The subjugation intensified in a way that had a kind of horrible logic to it. The more the Rakata Empire fractured, the more brutally they clung to what they held, and the more brutally they clung, the more certain it became that what they held would slip through their fingers like sand. But that realization came slowly, and by the time it arrived, it was too late. On Manarn, where the Selkath had been enslaved in coastal settlements to harvest kolto, a fluid vital to Rakatan medicine and tech maintenance, the production demands became impossible. The Selkath were force-insensitive, which meant they could not directly operate Rakatan machinery. They were useful only as labor, and labor could be broken. So the Rakata drove them harder, and the Selkath began to die in larger numbers, and the Rakata, instead of moderating their demands, simply replaced them, with more enslaved populations culled from other worlds, an endless carousel of suffering that turned the seas of Manarn red. On Dantooine, the agricultural worlds where enslaved populations grew food to feed the Empire's military and workforce, the same logic applied. Produce more faster at any cost. The soil itself began to fail from overwork, but the quotas never lessened. It is almost as if the Rakata, in their civil war, had abandoned any pretense of sustainability and simply decided to consume their own foundation so long as that consumption bought them another week, another month, another cycle of dominance before the inevitable collapse. I think what troubles me most about this period is how comprehensible it is. It would be easier if this were uniquely evil, if it were something only the Rakata could have become in their peculiar position of power. But we recognize this logic. We have seen it played out again and again across the galaxy's history. A ruling power fractures internally, grows insecure, and responds by tightening its grip on those it oppresses, as if brutality could substitute for the unity it has lost. The enslaved worlds felt this shift like a change in the pressure of the air itself. For thousands of years, the Rakata had been masters, terrible, absolute, and in their way almost serene in their mastery. But a serene master is sometimes, paradoxically, slightly more sustainable than a desperate one. The Rakata, desperate now, began to appear less like inevitability and more like predators in a corner, willing to destroy anything around them rather than acknowledge their own decline. And as that truth began to spread, whispered across star systems where enslaved peoples had contact, carried in the subtle knowledge that the masters were no longer confident in their own dominion, something shifted in the hearts of those who had been forced to accept the infinite empire as eternal. If the Rakata could bleed, then they could fall. If they could fall, then perhaps the enslaved worlds no longer needed to be eternal slaves. That question, once asked, could never be unasked. The subjugation intensified, but it had planted its own seeds of resistance. The Rakata, in their desperation to maintain control, had guaranteed they would lose it. It is a strange thing to witness in the records, the moment when the oppressed stop asking for mercy and begin, instead, to ask for their freedom. For thousands of years, the enslaved worlds had endured their subjugation as something almost like weather. Inevitable, vast, the normal condition of existence under Rakata rule. But when the masters began to devour their own dominion, when the Rakata's internal fracture meant that the quotas could no longer be met without the complete annihilation of the species being exploited, something shifted in the consciousness of the oppressed. The Wookiees of Kashyyyk, whose forests had fed the infinite empire for millennia, watched their ancient trees stripped not to fuel an empire, but to fuel a civil war between Rakata factions who no longer spoke to one another. The Selkath, whose waters had been harvested for their biochemical genius, saw their own people drowned in waves of extraction that served no logic except desperation. The humans scattered across a dozen colony worlds, on Tatooine, on Dantooine, on worlds whose names have been lost even to the archives, began to recognize in their masters brutal, new demands not the measured confidence of inevitable dominion, but the panic of something dying. There's a document, fragmented but readable, from a gathering that took place on a neutral station orbiting what would later be called Manaan, a world whose Selkath had already begun secret negotiations with neighboring enslaved peoples. The document doesn't name the organizer, but the signature beneath the proposal is clear enough. The Wookiees would send their strongest, the Selkath would share their medical knowledge and their understanding of hyperspace anomalies, the scattered human colonies would contribute their resource networks and what remaining shipcraft they could salvage. It was the first real act of defiance, not by a single species, but by multiple species, setting aside rivalries so old that some of them predated even the Rakata's arrival on those worlds. The Wookiees and the humans, for instance, had harbored deep suspicion of one another, the humans as conquerors and the Wookiees as those who remembered being conquered first. To come to the table together meant setting aside not just strategic differences, but ancestral grievances, the kind of wound that doesn't heal in a generation or 10. What united them was simpler and more powerful than old alliances could ever be. They were all dying, and the only thing that might save them was each other. I find myself thinking about what that conversation must have sounded like. The translators working overtime, the silences where old resentments gathered before being set aside, the moment when someone, somewhere, said the thing that made it possible. We have nothing to lose but the deaths they intend for us anyway. The alliance spread quietly at first, moving through underground networks, through the channels of enslaved species that had learned over millennia how to communicate without their masters noticing. The Rakata's fracture meant their oversight was less absolute than it had been, their surveillance networks compromised by factions that no longer trusted one another with intelligence. A shipwright on Kashyyyk would pass word to a navigator among the Selkath, who would carry it to human traders on the edges of controlled space, who would leave it coded in cargo manifests for the next waiting ear. What began forming in the space between the Rakata's attention was not just a military alliance, but something almost like a civilization of the dispossessed, a network of shared knowledge, shared resources, shared hope that unified them in a way the Rakata's own collective consciousness could no longer unify their masters. By the time the first coordinated shipments of weapons began moving between worlds, the architecture of rebellion had already been quietly constructed in the spaces the Rakata no longer watched. There's something important in that detail. I think that the alliance wasn't forged in a single glorious moment, but built in the slow, patient work of beings who had learned how to survive by noticing what their masters had stopped paying attention to. The Rakata had taught their slaves, across millennia, the art of invisibility, the skill of moving through empire unnoticed. Now that same skill was being turned toward the Empire's undoing. A Wookiee general whose name we have only in fragments, something that translates roughly as Shatran, though that word means both voice and scar, organized the military structure of the Alliance, working with human tacticians and Selkath strategists who understood the waterways and atmosphere generators that would become crucial to the coming conflict. They didn't have the Rakata's technological supremacy, but they had something that had been slowly building across generations of subjugation. They knew how to fight in the places where they lived. They knew every cave system of Kashyyyk, every underground water current of Manaan, every trade route and hidden settlement of the scattered human worlds. The Rakata had always held their dominion at the apex, their gaze falling downward from certainty. The Alliance would rise from below, from the intimate knowledge of 1,000 worlds' hidden places. What fascinates me most when I sit with these records is the gentleness of it, the way the Alliance moved, the way it chose not to escalate to violence until every other channel had been exhausted. There were delegations sent to Rakata command stations, formal requests for mercy, for reduced quotas, for the recognition that these species were not resources to be consumed, but peoples with their own right to exist. All of them were refused, and some of them were answered with violence that only hardened the resolve already forming in the Alliance's minds. By 10,000 years before the founding of the Republic, at the moment this chapter settles, the Alliance had begun to understand itself as inevitable. They were not asking anymore whether they could win. They were beginning to ask what kind of galaxy they wanted to build when they did. That question, quietly voiced in meeting chambers and whispered across hyperspace communications, was the real beginning of the rebellion that would come. The Rakata, fracturing from within, had no idea that below them, in the slow dark of enslaved worlds, something unified was gathering itself together, learning to move with purpose, preparing to challenge the masters who had taught them that mastery itself could be broken. There is a weight to this moment in the records, not the weight of dramatic confrontation, but the weight of inevitability arriving quietly, the moment when the long arc of history begins to bend, and no one yet knows that this is the point of no return. In the quiet spaces between stars, in the gaps the Rakata's civil war had carved into their own attention, the first coordinated strike began, not with a declaration or a signal that would have alerted their masters, but with a choice that each enslaved people made separately and then together. On Kashyyyk, the great forests had been stripped down to their roots by Rakata extraction crews, and the Wookiees who survived the labor camps understood something their ancestors had not. Their masters were busy fighting each other, and attention had turned inward toward Lehon. The Selkath of Manaan, whose waters had run red for 8,000 years under occupation, began moving weapons through their deepest trenches, not elegant, not advanced, but theirs, built from what the Rakata had not bothered to take because they thought it worthless. What made the rebellion possible was not courage, though there was that, but something quieter, the accumulated knowledge that the invincible had become visible, that the masters who could not be challenged could now be hurt. General Shatran, the Wookiee commander whose name had become legend in whispered conversations across a dozen enslaved worlds, did not think of this as revolution. He thought of it as recognition, as the moment when the enslaved peoples simply acknowledged what they had always been. The strikes, when they came, were not uniform or simultaneous in the way a unified force might have orchestrated them. Instead, they came like a wave that had been building for millennia, finally arriving at the shore. Each colony world rising in its own moment, each species fighting with the weapons and knowledge they had. On Tatooine, human slaves and others whose bloodlines had been mixed by forced breeding for 10,000 years struck at the Star Forge relay stations that channeled extracted resources toward Lehon. And for the first time, they succeeded in keeping what they had destroyed. The Rakata were too divided to send reinforcements. What is remarkable, looking back at this moment, is how much of what sustained the rebellion was not military at all, but psychological. The simple fact that enslaved peoples who had never imagined themselves capable of organized resistance discovered they were not only capable but coordinated, that their scattered uprisings formed a pattern, that somewhere beneath the Rakata's notice they had built something. The Rakata, fracturing as they were, still possessed technologies that should have crushed the rebellion like sand in a fist. The Star Forge's weapons, the Ravager waiting in its orbital yards, the command of hyperspace itself through force sensitivity that no enslaved species could match. But the Rakata could not deploy these weapons uniformly because they were not unified enough to command them. And even when they tried, they discovered something that the enslaved peoples had learned slowly, and the Rakata were only beginning to understand: that overwhelming power is not the same as control, that you cannot simultaneously crush rebellion everywhere, that coordination across 1,000 worlds requires either absolute loyalty or such perfect unity that your own fracturing becomes your enemy. Shatran understood this with the clarity of someone who had lived under occupation his entire life, whose entire civilization had been pressed into shapes it had not chosen. The Rakata's divided strength meant their force could be met and matched by the enslaved people's united weakness, and in that collision, something would break. The rebels had no expectation of easy victory. What they had was the understanding that the alternative to fighting was slower, more certain death, and that was enough. Across Kashyyyk's wounded forests, across Manon's depth, across the mining colonies and slave worlds and penal settlements and labor camps, where the galaxy's first civilization had built its empire on the backs of those it considered less than sentient, fires began to burn. These were not the fires of grand rebellion as told in later histories. They were practical, necessary fires, destroying infrastructure that served the masters, disrupting supply lines, taking back territory block by block, world by world, not out of some universal principle, but out of the very immediate need to survive the next year and the year after that. What is sometimes lost, when histories are written by victors or by scholars far removed from the moment, is the weight of simply choosing to resist when resistance might kill you, when the machinery arrayed against you seems to touch the very horizon. But the enslaved peoples of the Rakata's empire were already dying. They were already being consumed. The only genuine risk was dying sooner, and against that logic, they had reached a limit of what they would endure. The Rakata leadership, what remained unified of it, seemed at first almost dismissive of these uprisings, treating them as the thrashing of insects beneath a boot, the kind of local disturbance that military force had always suppressed. But something was different this time, and it took them longer than it should have to understand what. The disturbances were not isolated, they were resonant, they spoke to each other, they moved with something like intention, and each strike made the next one easier because it showed the enslaved worlds that resistance was possible. In the temples of Lehon, where the Rakata's philosophers and generals still maintained the fractured remnants of collective consciousness, the initial confidence began to curdle into something else. Doubt, perhaps, or the beginning of the realization that they had built something that had become fragile in ways they had not predicted. By the year 9000 before the Republic, the rebellion was no longer a whispered possibility. It was a burning fact, and the Rakata were beginning to understand that they were not fighting isolated uprisings, but a coordinated alliance of species that had learned, in the spaces where their masters were distracted by fighting each other, how to become an army. And that army was hungry and patient and had nowhere to retreat to but victory. 1,000 worlds had known absolute certainty in their chains, and that certainty, once broken, does not mend easily. The architects' fleets, which had swept across star systems with the precision of thought itself, now found themselves scattered and reactive, responding to fires instead of setting them. It is one of those reversals that seems obvious in hindsight, but must have been almost incomprehensible as it was happening. The masters discovering that mastery, once fractured from within, becomes fragile in ways their own philosophy had never prepared them to understand. The rebellion that had begun in secret across enslaved colonies was no longer scattered. Wookiee strike forces moved with Selkath coordination. Humans fought alongside species whose names had been erased from all records, and the networks of resistance had woven themselves into something the architects could not simply suppress by force. General Shatran and the other commanders of the United Worlds were not winning through superior tactics or technology. They could not have done so, not against the Star Forge, not against the raw power the architects could still command. What they were winning through was something the architects had made impossible for themselves. They were winning through unity born of absolute desperation, through peoples who had nothing left to lose and everything yet to gain. The architects, by contrast, were fighting over the meaning of their own existence, over whether the Force demanded mastery or whether mastery had been a lie they had told themselves for tens of thousands of years. You cannot fight a determined enemy while arguing with yourself about whether you should be fighting at all. The civil war that had fractured the architects' collective consciousness had done something worse than simply divide their fleets and dilute their power. It had made it possible for them to lose in the first place. Before the schism, the idea of defeat would have been almost nonsensical. The thought would have been absorbed into the unified mind and either reconciled or simply overwritten by collective will. Now Kelkorath's faction commanded the Star Forge and could manufacture warships in numbers that should have been impossible to resist. But they could not manufacture unity, and without it, their technological supremacy began to look less like dominion and more like a very expensive way of delaying the inevitable. Velkish's circle, which had severed itself from the collective consciousness entirely, had lost access to the unified networks that made coordinated strategy possible. They fought now more like isolated warlords than like the architects of a coherent empire. The enslaved worlds pressed their advantage with the kind of cold patience that only comes from knowing that failure means annihilation. They had seen what the architects did to resistance, and the knowledge that they had nothing more to lose made them formidable. Kashyyyk, where the Wookiee forests had been stripped nearly bare, erupted into coordinated ambushes against architect transport lines. Their knowledge of their own world had become a weapon the occupiers could not counter. Manarn's waters, poisoned by the brutality of extraction, nonetheless harbored Selkath warriors who had learned to move through their own oceans in ways the architect's technology could not predict. Tatooine's deserts, which had been made into open grave, produced fighters from among the slave populations who knew that survival meant victory. The architects had not expected this, I think, not truly, because they had never needed to expect anything, never needed to imagine their dominion challenged by those they had deemed lesser. There is something in the records, in the fragmentary documents, and the messages intercepted in the late days of their empire that speaks to a kind of bewilderment, not fear, not quite yet, but the shock of discovering that certainty itself could be questioned by events. 8,000 years before the Republic would be founded, the architects were learning a lesson they had perhaps needed to learn for 10,000 years. That power built on a lie, even a lie you believe, stands on hollow ground. The Star Forge, that miraculous station that had manufactured infinity, could produce ships faster than the United Worlds could destroy them. and yet it could not produce unity among the architects themselves. Both Kelkorath's faction and the remnants of Velkish's philosophy understood intellectually that they faced collapse, but neither could imagine a future worth fighting for that did not involve the total eclipse of the other. The rebellion did not defeat the architects through superior strength. It defeated them by moving through the space their internal conflict had opened. For thousands of years, the architects had been building monuments to their own dominance, monuments that would outlast them, that would leave records for some future era to find and puzzle over. Now those same monuments became focal points of resistance, became symbols not of the architect's invincibility, but of a master so confident in its supremacy that it had forgotten to imagine the people it ruled might someday choose to fight back. There is something almost gentle in the way it happened, in the records, not a dramatic clash of equal forces, but a slow erosion, the way water undermines stone not through violence, but through patient, inevitable presence. The architects, who had once believed their dominance was written into the very structure of the galaxy, now found themselves faltering not because some external force was stronger, but because they had become their own opposition. I find myself thinking about that a lot, about what it means to be broken not by enemies, but by your own fracture, about the peculiar vulnerability of those who have never had to imagine themselves as anything but victorious. It is not a tragedy of the type where heroes are brought low by enemies. It is something quieter and perhaps more instructive, the recognition that certainty, once lost, cannot be restored by force alone. The worlds that had groaned under architect rule for tens of thousands of years were learning to breathe, were learning what it felt like to take back even a small part of what had been taken from them. The architects were learning something harder, that a civilization that builds itself on the subjugation of others contains within it, always, the seeds of its own unmaking. What happens when a civilization retreats is different from what happens when it falls. There is a moment, narrow and fragile, where one becomes the other, and everything depends on whether those retreating still believe they can hold something. By 7,500 years before the Republic, the Rakata had begun that retreat, and with it came a shift in their thinking so profound that few among them could articulate it without pain. The outlying colonies, Kashyyyk, Manaan, Tatooine, the scattered systems where their dominion had seemed most absolute, were being surrendered, not out of strategy, but out of necessity, as Kelkorath's forces and what remained of Velkish's fractured circle could no longer maintain simultaneous control of the vast networks that had once seemed effortless to command. What they were retreating to was Lehon, the home world, and the great stations that orbited it in concentric rings of power and sacred purpose. The Star Forge itself had become something between a fortress and a shrine, still manufacturing, still terrible, but now understood as the last place where their unified strength might be reconstituted rather than the heart of an empire that could afford to be everywhere. You have to understand what that shift meant. It meant accepting that the galaxy was being lost and that only Lehon could be saved. The Rakata had been masters for so long that the very concept of asterisk, choosing what they would keep rather than asterisk, holding all that they possessed, seemed like a kind of death. And in a way, it was. The great temples and archives of their core worlds were being fortified in ways they had never been before, not because outsiders were coming, though they were, but because the Rakata themselves were beginning to understand that something precious inside their own civilization needed to be defended against dissolution. I find myself thinking about the difference between a fortress meant to keep enemies out and one meant to preserve something from being lost entirely from within. The temples held not just records, but the memory structures of the collective consciousness itself, the accumulated philosophical knowledge of 100,000 years of expansion, the patterns of unity thought that had made the Rakata what they were. If those were lost, then the knowledge of how to be Rakata, how to think together, how to feel the force in unison, would dissolve with them. And so the retreating forces brought back to the core worlds the most sacred of those archives, the oldest knowledge vaults, the instruments through which their people had once sustained their unified mind. It was a measure of hope, in a way. If we can preserve the knowledge of what we were, perhaps we can be that again. But it was also an unconscious admission that they might not be that again, that the unity might have been broken too completely, scattered across too many severed minds. The general commanding the evacuation of Tatooine, a figure whose name was recorded in military logs as one of Kelkorath's trusted officers, oversaw the withdrawal of the final garrison and the securing of the star maps that had marked the world's inclusion in the Infinite Empire. He watched the transports rise from that desert world and felt the weight of what was being abandoned. Not just a garrison, not just resources, but the pretense that the Rakata could hold everything, that their mastery was eternal. On Kashyyyk, the great processing stations where Wookiee labor had been organized into the machinery of Empire were methodically destroyed rather than left for the advancing resistance to claim. A decision that revealed something about how the Rakata mind was working now. Better to annihilate our own infrastructure than allow others to repurpose it. Better to leave nothing but rubble than risk our technology in enemy hands. That was the language of an empire in real, existential fear, and the enslaved peoples who watched these destructions unfold understood, with a clarity that sharpened their resistance, that they were no longer facing an enemy that felt certain of victory. The retreat itself was slower than it might have been, which was perhaps the most revealing choice of all. The Rakata did not flee in panic. They withdrew in an orderly manner, systematically dismantling the visible monuments to their dominion and gathering the sacred and technological treasures back toward the homeworld. There is a dignity in that choice, a kind of terrible grace, an empire determining how it will fall, which pieces of itself it will try to save, which it will destroy rather than abandon. And yet that very deliberateness meant that everywhere they retreated from, they left scars. Burned worlds, poisoned installations, the husks of star maps whose hyperspace coordinates had been erased. The galaxy they were retreating from was not a place they were simply leaving. It was a place they were diminishing, pulling their light out of it in a way that left only shadow behind. The core worlds themselves began to glow with activity in those years. Not the golden light of expansion, but something harsher, more focused. Lehon and the worlds nearest it were transformed into concentric rings of defense. The outermost held military installations and the last of the truly operational fleets. The next held the scientific academies and the laboratories where the Rakata had developed their hyperspace navigation. And at the center, on Lehon itself, stood the temples and the great archives. It was, I think, a configuration born of both hope and despair. The hope that they could hold something sacred, the despair that they probably could not hold it forever. The Rakata of this period faced a question they had never contemplated before. What happens when the thing you are breaks into pieces and keeps breaking? Do you try to glue it back together? Do you accept that the new shape is what you are now? Do you retreat into smaller and smaller spaces, defending them more fiercely, until finally you are defending nothing but a principle? The answer for the Rakata was that they did not know. They had never had to know. Their entire civilization had been built on the assumption that unity was their natural state, that disagreement could be absorbed and reharmonized, that fracture was not a possibility their biology or society would have to accommodate. And yet here it was, the fracture had happened, and they were trying to hold it back the only way they knew how. With walls, with technology, with the fierce preservation of whatever remnants of the collective mind still functioned. In the temples, the elder philosophers who had not joined either Kelkorath's circle or Velkish's dissidents began to ask, quietly and with a weight of futility, whether the unity had ever truly existed as they understood it. Whether what they had called the collective consciousness had always been, in some crucial way, a fiction maintained by force of will and the binding power of the Force itself. If the Force could fracture their minds, could it have been holding them in artificial alignment all along? These were dangerous questions, heretical almost, but they were being asked in the depths of the archive temples, and there was no longer an undivided Rakata consciousness to suppress them. I find myself wondering what those philosophers felt, watching their civilization retreat toward its core, knowing that what they were defending might not be able to be defended, that the unity they were trying to preserve was already so fractured that the very act of preservation might be futility. And yet they did it anyway. They gathered the knowledge, fortified the temples, organized the defenses, and waited for the next assault with a kind of grim, necessary hope. It was the stance of a people who had lost the future and were trying to preserve the past. The galaxy they had conquered continued to rise up against them, and in the temples of Lehon, the architects of the infinite empire prepared for a siege they suspected they could not win. There is a moment in every dying thing when the dying itself becomes unbearable, and those holding the line begin to ask whether the line is worth holding. The Rakata's civil war had been tearing them apart for centuries by the time we reach 7,000 years before the Republic, and the fracture had become infected. Not with doubt, precisely. The traditionalists still had their certainties, and Kelkorath's faction still gripped the Star Forge with an iron hand, but with a new kind of exhaustion, one that comes when you realize you are not fighting an enemy but yourself. There existed within the Rakata government, in the halls of power on Lehon itself, a group of thinkers and administrators who had come to a conclusion that was, in its way, the most heretical thing anyone had yet proposed. Perhaps the Empire did not need to be won. Perhaps it only needed to stop breaking. They came from both the traditionalist side and from Kelkorath's war machine, which made them, in the eyes of the hardliners, something far worse than simple dissidents. They were sympathizers, traitors to the idea of total victory. The leader of this movement, though leader is perhaps too grand a word for someone who spoke more to listen than to command, was a figure known to history only in fragments. Maleth the Counselor, an elder Rakata whose mind had touched the collective consciousness so deeply for so long that its fracturing had left him in a state of profound, lucid grief. He could not unknow what he had known when all the Rakata mind was one. He could not unsee the agony of the severance. And in his grief, he had begun to think the unthinkable. What if the Empire had always been a mistake? Not a mistake of execution, but of conception. What if the infinite Empire had been an expression of a fundamental misunderstanding of what the Force actually wanted? These were dangerous thoughts on Lehon in those days, thoughts that could get you removed from the collective consciousness altogether, left isolated in your own skull with only your private anguish for company. But Maleth spoke them anyway, carefully, to those he trusted. Administrators exhausted by managing enslaved worlds that fought back, soldiers who had lost too many kin to the fratricidal violence between the factions, scholars who had begun to suspect that the monuments they erected were tombstones. Their proposal was this: approach Kelkorath with an offer of genuine peace, not victory. Step down from dominion over the enslaved worlds in an orderly way, over generations if necessary, and allow those species to find their own path. In exchange, the Rakata would consolidate around their homeworld, rebuild their unity on a new foundation, one based not on the broken collective consciousness of mastery, but on something humbler. Shared survival. The very idea was almost incomprehensible to anyone raised in the infinite empire. To the traditionalists, it sounded like erasure, the annihilation of everything that made the Rakata who they were. To Kelkorath's hardliners, it sounded like cowardice dressed up in philosophy. But there were others, quietly, desperately, who began to listen. The irony, which I find myself thinking about a great deal, is that Maleth and his circle were not wrong about what needed to happen. They read the situation with an accuracy that the architects of total victory could not muster. The Empire was already lost, had been lost the moment the unity fractured, and the only real choice left was how to die, as a falling star that pulled everything down with it, or as something that might, in its retreat, preserve some core of what made the Rakata more than just conquerors. For a moment, a brief, fragile moment, it seemed as though Kelkorath might consider it. The warlord was not stupid. He could read a military map as well as anyone, could see that the rebellion was not a momentary uprising, but a coordinated resistance that would only grow stronger as the Rakata remained divided. There are records, fragmentary and disputed, suggesting that Kelkorath and Maleth met, spoke, understood each other in a way that the hardliners on either side could not. Perhaps in that conversation, there was even a moment when the warlord and the philosopher saw the same thing, the shape of survival and what it would cost. But if that moment existed, it did not hold. What happened next is where the story of the Rakata becomes truly tragic, as opposed to merely catastrophic. Before any negotiation could be formalized, before any offer could be made to the enslaved worlds, Maleth and his faction were betrayed by their own. Not by Kelkorath, by the traditionalists, who saw in the peace movement nothing less than the final dissolution of everything they had defended. The elders of the Traditionalist Council, guardians of the old ways, orchestrated what amounted to a coup within the fractious Rakata government. They moved against Maleth's circle with a precision that suggested they had been waiting for an excuse. The councillor and those closest to him were removed from power, exiled to the outer temples, their access to the collective consciousness severed in a way that left them alive, but in the Rakata's experience, essentially erased. The betrayal shattered what fragile momentum had been building. Kelkorath, suddenly facing renewed pressure from the traditionalists, abandoned any consideration of negotiation and doubled down instead on conquest, on military dominance, on the very strategies that were already failing him. In moving against the peace faction, the traditionalists believed they were saving the empire. In fact, they were administering the final poison that would ensure its collapse. There is a terrible irony in that. The faction most devoted to preserving the old ways, the old unity, the old certainties, ensured that those things would never be preserved at all. What they destroyed was not weakness, but the only path that might have led to any kind of continuity. Maleth lived out his remaining years in the temples, a mind separated from the only kind of consciousness it had ever known how to sustain, watching his civilization burn from behind the walls that were meant to contain it. History does not record what he thought in those final days, whether he cursed himself for speaking too soon, or whether he held to the belief that he had at least tried to offer the architects another choice. But he was there, isolated and aware, when the great collapse finally came. And I think there is something almost unbearable in that, to know what should have been done, to have said it, and then to be silenced not by your enemies, but by those you were trying to save. The peace faction's destruction did not end resistance to Kelkorath's dominion. It only ensured that no one would ever again seriously suggest that the empire could be gracefully transformed from within. The Rakata would have to fall, now, completely and almost irreversibly, because the only alternative was no longer even being discussed. The final betrayal was not a conspiracy or a single treacherous act. It was the triumph of those too frightened to change, too invested in the old ways to see that those ways were already dead. And in that triumph lay the seeds of absolute, irretrievable collapse. At 6,500 years before the Republic, the Rakata civilization reached a threshold from which no retreat was possible, and I think we should sit with what that moment felt like, even though no one alive today was there to record it. The Empire had already lost something essential, the coherence of mind that had made them invincible, but they had not yet lost the capacity to pretend that what they still held was enough. The peace faction's exile had shattered that pretense. When Maleth and his circle were severed from the collective consciousness itself, the other Rakata experienced it not as a political defeat, but as a kind of death within the Empire's own body. Minds that had never known isolation, suddenly felt the absence of voices that had always been there. And in that absence, something broke that could not be mended by force of will. The traditionalist elders, believing they had preserved unity by silencing dissent, discovered instead that they had killed the only mechanism left that could have saved it. On the enslaved worlds, this shattering was felt as a sudden, strange weakness in the oppressor's gaze. The Rakata had always been watched, always felt through some sense that existed below consciousness as an absolute and directed presence. And then that presence fractured. For the first time in 10,000 years of bondage, slaves on Kashyyyk and Manaan and Tatooine looked up and saw not certainty in their master's eyes, but something much more dangerous: panic. The uprisings that had been careful and coordinated began to become urgent. In the temples and academies of Lehon itself, the records begin to tell us something remarkable. The Rakata started, in this period, to keep written accounts of what was happening. This alone is significant. A species that had always relied on the shared memory of the collective consciousness, on knowledge flowing directly from mind to mind, began suddenly to write things down. They were trying to preserve what was slipping away. The scholar priests committed to stone and datapad the architectural blueprints of the Star Forge, the formulae for breeding force sensitivity, the meditation techniques that held the collective consciousness together. They were making a record in case, and I think this is the moment when they allowed the thought to surface, in case there was no one left to remember. The Star Forge itself, that magnificent and terrible engine that had powered everything, began to falter. The weapon systems that Kelkarath's faction had pushed to impossible extremes, the superweapons that had unmade star systems, those still functioned, but with increasing instability. The station itself, that vast orbital monument to Rakata ambition, began to show signs of corruption that no amount of dark side channeling could repair. There are reports from this period of crews experiencing psychic feedback from the station's processors, of workers aging rapidly or going mad from proximity to the weapon's residual energies. The Star Forge was poisoning itself with its own terrible power, and perhaps that is a fitting metaphor for what was happening to the civilization as a whole. The military collapse accelerated through the outer territories. General Shatran's forces liberated Kashyyyk in a coordinated assault that, had the Rakata possessed their full unity, would have been repelled in hours. Instead, Kelkarath's scattered fleets arrived piecemeal, weakened, their force-sensitive pilots still attuned to hyperspace routes that made sense only within the unified consciousness, corridors of probability that had begun to collapse as that consciousness fragmented. The Wookiees, fighting with the desperation of a species who had watched their forests burned for millennia, broke through. Similar scenes played out across the Empire. Manaan's Selkath rose with organized military precision, their understanding of their own world systems giving them an advantage against an occupying force that could no longer think as one. The enslaved humans, scattered across a dozen systems, began to coordinate their own rebellions, no longer subject to the unified psychic surveillance that had once made every whispered resistance plan known to their oppressors. And the Rakata, for the first time in their entire history, had to face the prospect of actual defeat. There is something in the historical records from this period, fragmented as they are, that suggests the moment the Rakata fully grasped what was happening was neither quick nor merciful. It was drawn out across years and decades, a slow understanding that the galaxy they had mastered was slipping away, not all at once, but in pieces. First, the outer colonies fell silent. Then the relay stations stopped responding. Then supply ships bound for the furthest outposts simply vanished into regions that were no longer under Rakata control. Each lost world was a severing, a cutting away of the consciousness that had extended through it. The pain of that disconnection, psychological, spiritual, and perhaps even physical for a species so dependent on unified thought, must have been extraordinary. I find myself thinking about what that must have cost them, not in resources or territory, but in the coherence of self. What does dissolution feel like to a mind that has never been alone? The retreat to Lehon and the core worlds was not, as we discussed in the previous chapter, disorderly or desperate in appearance. It was executed with military discipline and strategic intelligence. But it was, unmistakably, a retreat. The Rakata abandoned 500 worlds. 500. They left behind technologies they could no longer maintain, populations of enslaved species who would begin, in their absence, to develop their own civilizations, and monuments to a supremacy that would become, within a few thousand years, nearly incomprehensible to the beings who encountered them. By the time this contraction was complete, the infinite empire was no longer infinite. It was finite. It was local. It was, to use the word that appears again and again in the fragmentary records from this time, diminished. The question that haunts the later philosophical texts from this period is whether the Rakata could have made a choice that would have changed the outcome. The historians and the mourning theologians asked it obsessively. Had the empire truly been doomed from the moment of its first philosophical fracture, or had they murdered it themselves through the choices they made? Had Maleth's peace faction, if given genuine authority, been able to broker a graceful transformation into something smaller but coherent? Or was the collapse inevitable the moment a species founded entirely on unified consciousness began to contain within itself beings who wanted to be singular? These are questions we cannot answer. What we can say is that by 6,500 years before the Republic, the choice had been made. The peace faction was silenced, the warnings ignored, the last path to graceful transformation closed. All that remained was the collapse itself, still unfolding, still accelerating, now unstoppable. The ghosts of what the Rakata had been were still walking through Lehon's temples, still remembering mastery and unity, and the moment when they were certain they would rule forever. And in the years to come, those ghosts would face something that no amount of dark side power could hold back: the absolute dissolution of everything they had been. What happens to a people when they choose not to survive as themselves? It is a question that settles differently on each of the 500 worlds the Rakata once held, and it settles hardest on Lehon itself, where the architects had drawn their last breath as a unified civilization. By 6,000 years before the Republic, the survivors, and there were survivors, scattered across the outer reaches and the rim, moving in small ships and remembering in fragments what they had been, began their exodus into silence. Some went willingly into the unknown regions, those uncharted spaces beyond the mapped hyperlanes where the galaxy simply stops having names, seeking isolation so complete that even the memory of their dominion might eventually dissolve. Others fought a last, terrible campaign to secure what they called the obscure worlds, distant colonies at the edge of navigation where they might rebuild something smaller, more survivable, though the word rebuild had become almost meaningless to them. The warlord Kelkarath, or what remained of his faction after the Star Forge itself, had begun to fail and corrupt, attempted to consolidate power around a handful of fortress worlds, clinging to the old dream even as the dream visibly burned around him. There was no poetry in it, I think, no grand last stand, no moment of nobility that made sense of the ending. There was only the slow hemorrhaging of a civilization, realizing that it had already ceased to exist as the thing it recognized itself as. The collective consciousness that had bound the Rakata across light years, that unified network of force-touched minds that made them feel like a single organism distributed across an empire, had fractured so thoroughly by this point that most of them could no longer sense each other at all. Imagine losing that, not gradually, but in waves. First, the ability to touch the minds of your neighbors across a city, then the cities themselves going silent, then the realization that the silence is permanent. Some scholars in later ages would write that the Rakata had essentially experienced the death of their entire civilization while still inhabiting their own bodies, a kind of spiritual extinction that persisted long after they had scattered and forgotten who they were. On Kashyyyk and Mannan, and across the liberated worlds, the enslaved species watched the architects withdraw, and there was a moment, brief, almost imperceptible, where victory transformed into something more complicated. The Wookiees, finally free, found that freedom meant inheriting a fractured world, and the quiet knowledge that their masters had destroyed something crucial within themselves rather than surrender to defeat. Some Rakata commanders, unable to reconcile themselves with the loss of dominion, chose annihilation rather than exile, weapons aimed at their own command vessels, or the activation of self-destruct mechanisms within the temples, as if they could at least control the manner of their ending. It was a terrible arithmetic. The Rakata had spent millennia teaching themselves that surrender was annihilation, and in the moment when surrender became necessary, they discovered they had spoken truer than they knew. On the Rim, in the wild and uncharted territories where the hyperlanes grew thin and unreliable, small cells of surviving Rakata attempted to build something new, something hidden. They carried with them fragments of the Star Forge's technology, though it was like carrying a beautiful instrument no longer anyone knew how to play. They had been so utterly dependent on their connection to the Force through technology that without it, the technology itself became dangerous. Half-sentient machines guarding empty temples, hyperdrives that would activate at random moments, weapons systems pointing at nothing in particular. There is something in that image that haunts me. The architects, the engineers of cosmic supremacy, reduced to tending machines they could no longer understand. Machines their own mastery had made so dependent on Force connection that they had become almost incomprehensible to rational analysis. Some survived to found hidden colonies, the lost cities, as they would later be called in the fragmentary records that would survive, though by then no one living had any certainty about their location or whether they still existed at all. Others simply faded into the vast indifference of the unknown regions, their ships eventually running out of fuel or supplies, adding their loss to the thousands of other disappearances that the galaxy would simply come to accept as the cost of traveling beyond the charted worlds. In the temples on Lehon, the remaining traditionalist elders, those who had exiled Maleth, the counselor who might have offered another path, looked at their own hands and found them unable to maintain the collective consciousness, even symbolically. The great mirrors and resonance chambers that had once allowed them to touch the minds of thousands across the stars grew silent, not because they were damaged, but because there was no longer anything unified enough to touch. They could feel individual minds, raw and isolated and terrified, scratching at the edges of connection, but the vast harmonic that had once been the Rakata was simply gone. Some accounts, and I should say here that many of these accounts are fragmentary, drawn from archives that would not be rediscovered for thousands of years, told through the lens of species who were now translating their conqueror's own mythology, suggest that certain circles of the architects attempted something extraordinary in their final moments of coherence. They created what we might call a record of warning, or perhaps a confession. Data structures and memory artifacts embedded in the very temples of Lehon, in the star maps they had distributed across the galaxy, in the architecture of the monuments they had left behind. If a future civilization were to discover these remnants, the thinking seemed to be, let them understand not the glory of the Rakata's rise, but the cost of their dominion. Let them see the mechanism by which mastery had devoured unity, by which the drive to control everything had made them unable to control themselves. Whether this was genuine foresight or simply the grieving mythology of conquered species projecting nobility onto their vanished masters, we cannot yet say with certainty. But what we know is that throughout the next millennia, as explorers and archaeologists would slowly piece together the fragments of this civilization, they would again and again encounter this tension. monuments to supremacy sitting alongside what appeared to be deliberate warnings about the cost of supremacy. By 6,000 years before the Republic, the architects, the ancient Rakata, who had once held dominion over 500 worlds and believed themselves invincible, had become a memory in the process of disappearing even from memory itself. They were not extinct, not quite. Survivors lived in hidden places, and the technology they had created would echo through the ages, waiting to be rediscovered. But the unified civilization, the collective consciousness that had made them what they were, had simply ceased. And in the temples on their homeworld, in the ruins of what had been the greatest empire the galaxy had known, something like silence settled, not the silence of peace, but the silence of a mind realizing that it no longer exists. What had been architecture had become archaeology, waiting across the centuries for someone to finally read what the architects had left behind and understand, if they could bear to, what it had cost to build. And so the Rakata, who had held the galaxy in their hands, began the long work of disappearing, not suddenly, but in the way that all great things disappear, one forgotten story at a time. By 5,000 years before the Republic, the scattered remnants of the architects retreated further, still into the unknown regions, seeking worlds where no records of their former dominion could reach them, where the very name Rakata might not echo through occupied territories like an accusation. What remained on the visible galaxy was fragments, the star maps scattered across Dantooine and Kashyyyk and Tatooine, slowly sinking into the soil, their purpose obscured by time and distance. The slaves who had rebelled and broken their master's grip, the Wookiees, the Selkath, the humans of 100 worlds, began the work of rebuilding their own cultures, their own memories. And in that rebuilding, they had little reason to preserve the story of those who had enslaved them. There is something deeply human in that impulse, I think. The desire to look forward rather than back, to define yourself by what you build rather than by what was done to you. But it meant that within a few centuries, the Rakata were no longer enemies or masters. They were already becoming something stranger. Ghosts with no names, ruins with no architects, technology whose builders had been forgotten. The early Republic, when it arose around 25,000 years before the rebellion, did not inherit the knowledge of the infinite empire so much as inherit its absence, a galaxy already emptied of the memory of its first great dominion. The Jedi, when they began to form into the order we would know, studied old archives and found references to the Ancient Ones and the first masters of hyperspace. But the records were fragmented, corrupted, or deliberately obscured by the Rakata themselves in their final coherence. I find myself thinking about that deliberate obscuring often, the idea that the last conscious architects, in their final moments of unified mind, chose what to preserve and what to bury. Did they hide their own history as an act of mercy, or as an act of mercy to the galaxy that they could no longer rule? The answer, I suspect, is both. Across millennia, the Rakata's technologies were rediscovered and reinvented without knowing their true source. Hyperspace travel became understood as a function of mechanical navigation rather than force-sensitive mastery. Cloning techniques were reimagined as biological engineering. The concepts behind the Star Forge were lost entirely, replaced by 100 smaller manufacturing stations, none of them drawing directly on the dark side, none of them quite as efficient as the original. It is as if the galaxy, in losing the knowledge of the Rakata, lost the knowledge of a certain kind of power entirely, and found, perhaps without meaning to, a kind of salvation in that forgetting. The Hutt cartel rose during this time, and they built their own empires on trade and slavery, but nothing like the scale of the infinite empire. And it is worth asking whether that smallness came from a lack of vision or a lack of the force-sensitive architecture that had made Rakata dominion absolute. The Sith, when they came later, tried to build something of that old power, tried to touch the dark side with the same absolute certainty the Rakata had possessed. But they were always working from fragments of the truth, half-remembered philosophy, tools without understanding of how they had been forged. There is a long historical silence between the fall of the Infinite Empire and the rise of the Old Republic, an era I think of as the medieval epoch of the galaxy, a time when great powers collapsed behind them and smaller powers jostled for prominence in a landscape none of them fully understood. During this time, the Rakata on Lehon itself underwent a transformation so profound that it amounted to a species-wide forgetting. They regressed from the unified consciousness that had been woven into their very biology into scattered tribes, the Black Rakata and the Elders and others, warring among themselves, their memories of the Infinite Empire becoming mythology, then legend, then whisper, then silence. The knowledge temples crumbled. The monuments to their supremacy became inexplicable monuments, their purposes misunderstood by the people who walked among them. The Star Forge, hidden in the maw, a cluster of black holes and stellar anomalies whose very existence had been carefully protected, faded into myth on their own homeworld. I think this is perhaps the cruelest element of their dissolution, that the Rakata did not merely lose their galactic dominion, they lost the memory of ever having possessed it, and in losing that memory, they lost the continuity of self. To be human, or to be anything like human, is to be rooted in the story of how you came to be who you are, and to lose that story is to become, in some fundamental sense, someone else entirely. The Rakata of the medieval epoch would not have recognized the unified consciousness of their ancestors, any more than a child raised in isolation might recognize the culture that shaped the language they speak. Across the inhabited worlds of the galaxy, the archaeological remnants of Rakatan rule became simply ancient things. The star maps were found by explorers and scholars, and their purpose was debated. The ruins were excavated and catalogued, and their creators remained unknown. The technologies were studied, and the dark side mastery that powered them was attributed to other, later civilizations, to the Sith, or to mythological precursor species that may never have existed. There is a tragic patience in this slow erasure, a sense that the architects themselves, in their exile and dissolution, accepted it as a necessary cost of their survival. If Lehon was hidden, if their records were scattered, if the knowledge of their empire became myth, then perhaps, the logic seems to have run, they would be left in peace. There would be no final wars of vengeance, no hunting of the last remnants across the galaxy, no attempt to resurrect the dominion they had lost. Obscurity became a kind of sanctuary. By the time the Jedi Order was well established, by the time the Old Republic had settled into its long centuries of relative stability, the Rakata were not even myths anymore. They were curiosities, puzzles for historians, unexplained artifacts in a galaxy that had moved on. A human scholar on Tatooine in this era might find a star map buried in the sand and wonder, briefly, what its cryptic glyphs meant, and then set it aside, preserved it in a collection of oddments, never knowing that it pointed back to the greatest empire the galaxy had ever known. That ignorance, that peaceful oblivion, seems to have been what the last coherent architects wanted for themselves and their species. Whether that desire came from wisdom or from defeat, I cannot say, but I suspect it was both. This chapter in the story of the Rakata, then, is a chapter about absence, about how a civilization that once held dominion over countless worlds faded from collective memory into silence, not because it was conquered and erased from without, but because it chose, in the end, to erase itself from within, accepting obscurity as the price of peace. It is a strange transformation, and a humbling one, a reminder that the most absolute power can fade into insignificance with the passage of enough time and the patient work of forgetting. The Rakata did not vanish suddenly. They vanished slowly, gently almost, the way stars fade into the background of the night sky when you stop looking directly at them. And in that fading, something of the warning they meant to leave behind faded too. The very monuments meant to preserve their story became evidence of a history no one could read, and the greatest civilization ever to rule the galaxy became, at last, truly invisible, not destroyed, but simply, finally, forgotten. There's a moment, I think, that every civilization has, when the archaeologists come. It happens long after the noise has stopped, after the empires have fallen into silence, after the people who built something magnificent have been gone so long that the ground itself has forgotten them. For thousands of years, the galaxy moved on without knowing what lay beneath its feet. On Dantooine, explorers found it first, a geometric structure half buried in prairie, so old that the soil had risen around it like a slow tide, and at first, nobody understood what they were looking at. It was a map, but not drawn on anything you could read like paper or stone. It was a structure itself, and when you approached it with the right instruments, with the right sensitivity to the force, it would activate. It would show you something. A star chart to a place nobody had ever heard of. They found others like it on Tatooine in the sand, on Kashyyyk, half swallowed by the forest, on Manaan, resting on the ocean floor, on Korriban, in the tombs where the Sith would later come to seek power they didn't know had been sought before. Each one identical in structure, separated by tens of thousands of years and thousands of light years of distance, and yet clearly made by the same hands. What struck the first scholars wasn't so much the artifacts themselves as the deliberateness of their placement. Someone had taken the trouble to leave these things behind. Someone had scattered them across enslaved worlds like breadcrumbs or like warnings, and had done it carefully enough that they would survive the fall of whatever civilization had built them. The ruins themselves told a different story, vast structures, not naturally formed, with a kind of architecture that suggested a people utterly confident in their ability to shape matter itself. On multiple worlds, explorers found cities that had been systematically dismantled, not destroyed, but taken apart, as if the people who built them had stepped back one day and decided to remove the evidence of their own occupation. There was something almost reverential about it, a deliberate choice to fade rather than to burn. The technology was perhaps the strangest part. Machines of impossible intricacy, systems that seemed designed to run on something other than the physical laws that governed normal engineering, devices that responded to presence and intention in ways that suggested a deep, almost intimate understanding of how the Force itself moved through the galaxy. When researchers tried to replicate or understand these systems, they found that most of them simply wouldn't function without someone Force-sensitive standing nearby, as if the builders had woven consciousness itself into the architecture. It was a kind of mastery that later civilizations could only approximate. For centuries, these discoveries remained isolated curiosities, each one catalogued and shelved and treated as a separate mystery. Ruins on Tatooine didn't necessarily speak to ruins on Kashyyyk. A star map on Dantooine was interesting in isolation, but didn't necessarily illuminate anything about the vast, automated factory that explorers would eventually find orbiting a world in the unknown regions. The builders themselves remained anonymous, so ancient and so thoroughly erased that they had become less a people than a question mark scattered across the galaxy. The scholarly consensus, for a long time, was that there had been several precursor civilizations, each one leaving behind fragments that would never be fully understood. The Gree, a tentacled species whose own descendants would eventually look at their ancestors' technology and find it incomprehensible, as if they had become too small for the thoughts that had made them. The Kwa, who had built the star temples, gates of pure teleportation, and then faded into obscurity, their descendants devolving into something simpler, something that no longer wanted the burden of that knowledge. The Sharu, who had hidden an entire advanced civilization beneath crude pyramids and willingly forgotten their own sophistication to escape some threat so profound that regression seemed preferable to survival. There was a pattern here, I think, though for a long time nobody was ready to name it. Precursor civilizations didn't decline gradually. They collapsed, or they chose to disappear, or they reached a point where knowledge itself became a liability they needed to shed. When scholars eventually found evidence that all of these mysteries, the star maps, the scattered monuments, the vast structures, and incomprehensible machines pointed to a single builder species, the realization came quietly, almost gently. They had called themselves the architects, or they had been called that by others, and they had not been a dozen scattered peoples, but one civilization so vast and so thoroughly obliterated from memory that it had taken thousands of years of excavation and careful analysis to reassemble the fact of their existence. The homeworld was supposed to be out there, somewhere in the unknown regions, accessible through those star maps if you could gather them all together and understand their language. But even that knowledge came with a strange weight, because the further scholars dug, the more evidence emerged that the architects had deliberately made it difficult to find them. Not impossible, but difficult enough that only someone with tremendous resources and determination would persist. It was as if they had left behind a test, or a warning disguised as a puzzle. What haunted me most, when I first encountered these discoveries, was the question of what they had wanted future peoples to understand. The monuments were beautiful, yes, and clearly the work of minds that could command matter and energy in ways that bordered on divine. But there was something else beneath the beauty, a kind of sorrow, perhaps, or a desperate hope that someone, someday, would find these ruins and learn from them. The architects had built something magnificent, and then they had walked away or been driven away, and all that was left was stone and silence, and the patient work of archaeologists trying to piece together a history that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to bury. And I find myself thinking that maybe that was the final gift, not the monuments themselves, which would eventually crumble, but the riddle they left behind, the puzzle that would take the galaxy thousands of years to solve, and in solving it, to understand that supremacy, no matter how total, no matter how absolute, no matter how justified it felt from the inside, always ends the same way. In ruins, in forgetting, in the slow, patient work of those who come after, trying to understand why. The star maps still point toward Lehon, patient as monuments, waiting to be found. Over the past few decades, a quiet revolution has been unfolding in the archives and universities across the known galaxy. Not a revolution of guns or starships, but of understanding, of scholars finally finding the thread that ties together thousands of isolated, bewildering fragments into something that resembles a coherent story. It began, as so many things do, with the accumulation of small pieces. A star map found half buried on Dantooine, another on Tatooine, another on Kashyyyk, each one intricate, each one impossibly old, each one pointing towards something that the finder could not quite name. For centuries, these discoveries were treated as separate mysteries, catalogued in different archives by different institutions, attributed to different builder species. The Gree, the Qua, the Sharu, each granted ownership of a piece of the puzzle without anyone noticing that the pieces were trying to fit together. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, scholars began to notice that the technology was consistent, that the design language was unified, that the age of these ruins, when carbon dating and force resonance analysis could pin it down, was far more ancient than anyone had anticipated and far more synchronized. I find myself thinking about what that must have felt like, that first moment when a researcher named Jolnan at the University of Coruscant realized that the star map from Dantooine matched the architectural style of the structures on Manaan, which matched the engineering principles embedded in ruins on Korriban. The realization would not have come all at once, but in accumulating weight. A footnote that should have been obvious, a connection that suddenly seemed too important to ignore, the slow dawning that what everyone had assumed was the work of a dozen different species was actually the work of one. And once that thread was pulled, everything else began to unravel, or rather, to weave itself together. Scholars began cross-referencing hyperspace calculations embedded in the star maps, and found that they pointed toward a homeworld in the unknown regions, a world whose name appeared in fragmented form in the oldest records the Academy had. Lehon, or Rakata Prime, or the unknown world, depending on which corrupted archive one consulted. The convergence of evidence was undeniable. A single civilization, force-sensitive and technologically sophisticated beyond the comprehension of modern powers, had built an empire spanning thousands of worlds, and had done so tens of thousands of years before the Republic. The Rakata, the scholars began to call them, using the name that appeared most consistently in the oldest texts, though the texts themselves were so fragmentary that even that name felt like a reconstruction, like trying to remember someone's face from a photograph taken in near darkness. And then came the harder work, understanding not just that they had existed, but why they had disappeared so completely, so thoroughly, that for millennia no one even knew to look for them. The fragmented records that survived, some in Rakata script, some in languages that had to be reconstructed, some encoded in technological artifacts that took decades to decode, told a story that was both intellectually fascinating and deeply, quietly troubling. The Rakata had not fallen to an external enemy, at least not in any simple way. They had fractured from within, their unified consciousness shattered by philosophical disagreement about the nature of their own power and its justification. There were references to a general named Kelkarath who had seized control of their greatest weapon, a superstructure called the Star Forge, and to a philosopher whose name was rendered variously as Velkish or Kelesh in different texts, who had led a faction questioning the moral foundation of their empire. There were descriptions of technologies that reshaped star systems, of wars that left permanent scars on the galaxy itself, of enslaved species rising in coordinated rebellion across hundreds of worlds. And most hauntingly, there were what scholars began to call the warnings, passages embedded in the star maps, and in the carved monuments the Rakata had left behind, passages that seemed designed to be found only by someone patient and resourceful enough to decode them, passages that spoke of the cost of mastery, of the way that absolute power inevitably corrodes the unity that created it. I think about this often, that a civilization that had been powerful enough to reshape worlds deliberately left behind a record, not of its glory, but of its failure, that it chose to be understood through the lens of its own collapse rather than through the monuments of its supremacy. The scholars who made these breakthroughs, Jolnan was joined by Murekes, a historian of ancient hyperspace technology, by Kathia, an expert in force-attuned architecture, by others whose names appear in the interdisciplinary publications that began to accumulate around 3,000 years before the current era, were not simply uncovering facts. They were engaged in an act of recovery, of resurrection. They were bringing back into galactic memory a civilization that had actively chosen to be forgotten, and in doing so, they were forced to grapple with why that choice might have been made. The Rakata, from what the records suggested, had not vanished because they were powerless. They had vanished because they understood, finally, that the power they had wielded had cost them everything that made them worth being unified, that the empire they had built had eroded the very consciousness that had built it. And so they had scattered, retreated, allowed themselves to devolve, to be swallowed by time and obscurity, and in their final coherence, they had left these fragments behind, not as a boast, but as a confession, a warning encoded in geometry and mathematics and force-sensitive technology, left for whoever might someday be powerful enough to find it. In the academies and research stations where this decoding was underway, scholars began to understand that they were not simply solving a historical puzzle. They were confronting a kind of mirror, being shown the trajectory of a civilization that had believed itself invincible, and then had to reckon with the cost of that invincibility. There's something almost unbearable in that, I think. The clarity with which the Rakata seem to understand that dominion, absolute dominion, contains within it the seeds of dissolution, and the way they chose to accept that dissolution rather than be consumed by the effort to deny it. The work of decoding continued, and with each discovery, the portrait of the Rakata became more vivid and more tragic, the record of their rise and fall becoming not a legend, but a documented, scholarly fact. And as that portrait emerged from the fragmentary evidence, a question began to form in the minds of those scholars, quiet at first, but growing more urgent with each passing year. If this had happened once before, if a civilization had built an empire so vast it seemed permanent, and then watched it crumble from internal corruption, what was to prevent it from happening again? That question, perhaps, is the legacy that the Rakata left most deliberately of all. Not a warning about what happened to them, but a question mark pressed into the future, waiting to be read. There is a moment that comes to every civilization, I think, when it finally understands what it has done, when the monuments stop speaking about triumph and begin to whisper about cost. The Rakata left us warnings, you see, scattered across 1,000 worlds in forms so deliberate that we can now read in them almost a confession. They are not hidden, these messages, not in any way that suggests shame or the desire to conceal. They are simply placed where only those searching hard enough, long enough, for the truth would ever find them. A star map on Dantooine, another on Tatooine's burning surface, others on Kashyyyk, on Manaan in its deepest waters, on Korriban in its tombs, each one a node in a network of testimony. And embedded within them, for those patient enough to look beyond the mechanism, are not maps at all but something closer to a confession. This is what we built, they say, and this is the weight of it. When Jolnan and the scholars who came after finally began to piece together the fragments, the impossible technologies, the Star Forge itself, the testimony of enslaved species whose memories had survived in oral tradition across millennia, they were reconstructing not a moment of conquest, but a mirror. It took centuries for the academic community to accept what the data was saying, that an entire civilization, one that had seemed invincible, had not fallen to external conquest at all. The Rakata fell because they fell apart from within, because the unity that was written into their very biology could not survive the weight of asking themselves whether mastery was destiny or merely cruelty with a different name. And here is what strikes me most about this. They did not simply vanish and leave behind ruins. They left behind records of their own undoing, monuments that functioned as both map and warning, technology that carried within it the signature of the corruption that had consumed them. The Star Forge itself is perhaps the clearest example of this, not hidden, but placed in a location that could only be reached by someone strong enough, determined enough, and ultimately ambitious enough to find it. Do you hear what that means? They left the key to infinite power within reach of anyone willing to search for it with sufficient intensity. It is almost as though they wanted to be found, or more precisely, as though they wanted the next great power to inherit their own cautionary tale written directly into the technology it would use. Revan and Malak, when they discovered the Star Forge thousands of years later, at the end of the Mandalorian Wars, found not merely a weapon, but a mirror of what the Rakata had become. And in using it, in drawing its power into themselves, they repeated almost exactly the pattern of corruption that had consumed the architects themselves. The Sith warlord Malak and his master Revan felt the dark side amplified through the Star Forge's systems, feeding on suffering and domination, until the tool became indistinguishable from the will that wielded it. Both of them fell into the same trap the Rakata had fallen into, the belief that unlimited power could sustain itself indefinitely, that dominion, once achieved, would not corrode from within. And they too were eventually destroyed, and the Star Forge with them, destroyed by a fleet and a Jedi Order that understood, on some level, what the Rakata had tried to teach. But here is the uneasy part. The warning was heeded in a sense, but only by destroying the tool, not by learning the lesson it contained. We destroyed the Star Forge to prevent it from being used, and we never quite asked ourselves, by what mechanism did an entire civilization, one with force-sensitive mastery and hyperspace technology, and a machine that could manufacture unlimited warships, come to fall? The historical record was there, pieced together from star maps and ruins, and the genetic regression of the Rakata themselves on Lehon, where they had devolved from philosophers and architects into warring tribes with no memory of what they had built. The message was, essentially, this: Dominion will consume you from the inside. The more absolutely you hold power, the more the unity that makes you powerful begins to fracture under the weight of maintaining absolute authority. The very mechanisms that let you conquer will eventually turn against you, because the people you conquer will not accept subjugation forever, and the people you trust to help you hold dominion will eventually ask themselves whether the empire they're maintaining is worth the cost. These are not failings of weak civilizations. These are failings embedded in the structure of absolute power itself. And I find myself thinking about this a lot when I consider what has happened in the millennia since Revan destroyed the Star Forge and the Jedi Order was rebuilt. The Jedi, for all their philosophy of balance and the acceptance of the Force's will, built their own empire of sorts, not galactic dominion, but spiritual and military authority that shaped the Republic for thousands of years. And the Sith, fragmented and hidden and pursuing domination through deception and the rule of two, built their own structure of absolute power, with a master and an apprentice locked in eternal tension, each knowing the other might kill them at any moment. Both drew their power from the Force itself, the way the Rakata had, and both, in the end, structured themselves around concepts of mastery that the Rakata had already proven were unstable. The most unsettling thing about the Rakata warnings is that they are not obscure, they are simply ignored. Not through malice or ignorance, but through the ordinary mechanism by which each civilization believes itself to be different from the ones that came before it, smarter, more careful, less susceptible to the patterns that have doomed others. Every power that rises seems to read the story of the architects and think, yes, what happened to them was tragic, but we understand better now. We will not repeat their mistake. And then the mechanisms of absolute power begin to function in them too. The fracturing of unity, the dehumanization of the conquered, the development of weapons so vast they leave scars on the galaxy itself. There is something almost gentle in the way the Rakata left their warnings, I think. They did not destroy their monuments or hide them in ways that would require force to access. They simply placed them where, if you wanted to understand, you could, if you were patient and careful and willing to look at what might make you uncomfortable. They left behind not just the star maps, but also the ruins of their wars, the desert where Tatooine's surface had been scored by orbital bombardment, the genetic record of their own devolution on Lehon, a complete testimony to what the cost of dominion had been. And we have read this testimony, those of us who have studied it, and found it clear and undeniable. And yet the warnings remain unheeded, in the sense that matters most. We continue to build structures of power that assume they will not collapse from within, that assume unity can be maintained through force, that assume dominion is sustainable. There is a weight in that contradiction that I cannot quite put down. The Rakata, in their final coherence before the collective consciousness failed entirely, made a choice to scatter these warnings across the galaxy. A choice to become, essentially, a teaching preserved in monuments rather than a civilization preserved in triumph. That choice itself is a kind of message. They understood that their civilization could not endure, and so they chose to ensure that something of what they had learned through suffering would endure instead. Whether we have the wisdom to learn what they tried to teach us, that is a question the galaxy is still answering. Tonight, I want to talk about what it means to hold the weight of a ghost. We have spent this entire journey watching a civilization rise to an almost incomprehensible height, masters of the Force itself, builders of impossible machines, wielders of technologies that reshaped star systems, and then fall, slowly at first, then all at once, until there was nothing left but ruins and fragments scattered across 1,000 worlds. But the ruins did not disappear, and neither did the questions they ask. In our own time, scattered across the Republic and beyond, scholars and archaeologists and ordinary people who stumble upon these things have begun to piece together what happened here, and the weight of that understanding has settled over us in ways I think we are only beginning to comprehend. When Jolnan and others finally decoded the pattern in the star maps, when they realized all these scattered monuments, All these ruins on Dantooine and Tatooine and Kashyyyk, all these impossible structures, belonged to a single builder civilization from tens of thousands of years ago. The initial reaction was wonder, the pure scholarly joy of having solved an ancient puzzle. We had found the architects. We knew their name now, Rakata. We knew their scale, hundreds of enslaved worlds, a unified consciousness, technologies that seemed almost godlike in their sophistication. But then came something else, something quieter and more unsettling. The realization that they had not merely fallen to external conquest the way empires often do. They had fallen because of what they themselves had become. The internal fractures, the philosophical schisms between leaders like Kelkarath and Velkish, the shattering of the collective consciousness that had made them invincible. These were not weaknesses imposed from outside. They were fractures that grew from within the system itself, from the very thing the Rakata believed was their greatest strength. And then there was the matter of the messages. Scholars like Ravan, studying the deeper records encoded in the temples and the monuments, began to understand that the Rakata had not simply collapsed and been forgotten. They had, in their final coherence, chosen to leave warnings. Confessions, really, embedded in the very technologies they scattered across the galaxy. Records of what dominion had cost them, of the price of absolute power, of the way mastery and unity cannot coexist for long before they begin to destroy each other. There is something deeply human in that choice, I think, even though the Rakata were not human. In the moment when they could no longer hold what they had built, when the weight of their own empire was crushing them from within, they chose to leave a message for whoever came after. This is what we learned. This is what we paid. Do not do what we did. And here is the part that keeps me awake sometimes, the part I find myself returning to over and over. We found those messages, and we did not listen to them. When Ravan and Malak rediscovered the Star Forge 3,000 years ago, when they found these same warnings and records, they did not step back and say, "Ah, yes, we understand the danger now, and we will choose differently." Instead, they walked straight into the same cycle of corruption the Rakata had warned against. They took the Star Forge, this massive, terrible machine that had already consumed its builders, and they used it to feed their own hunger for power, their own need for dominion, their own certainty that they could do what the Rakata could not. They could not. The Sith always believes the next one will be different, that the cycle can be broken by sheer force of will, that mastery is possible if only you are strong enough, ruthless enough, certain enough. The Rakata believed that too. So what does it mean, then, that we are a galaxy that knows this history now? We have the records, the monuments, the warnings, the decoded confessions left by a civilization that fell 10,000 years before any of us were born. We know what the cost of absolute dominion is. We know it in concrete detail. We know the names of the leaders whose fractures shattered their empire. We know the shape and weight of the technologies that consumed them. And yet we live in a time when power still concentrates, when visions of galactic dominance still seduce those who hold enough strength to imagine they might achieve it, when the same philosophical choices that fractured the Rakata are still being made in quiet council chambers and on strategy boards across known space. The new Sith, if they arise, will know the Rakata's history and will be certain they are the exception. The rising powers in the outlying regions, as they grow strong, will know what happened to the architects and will be convinced that their vision is different, more just, more stable, that the mistakes that brought down a civilization 10,000 years dead will not be repeated under their rule. I think about the slaves of the Rakata sometimes, the Wookiees of Kashyyyk, the Selkath of Manaan, the scattered humans whose ancestors were conquered and broken and remade in captivity. They did not have the luxury of believing the Rakata were invincible, the way the Rakata's own people did. They had to recognize, generation after generation, that their masters were flawed, mortal, capable of being challenged. And when the fracture finally came, they moved with patient purpose to exploit it. They did not think the Rakata were inevitable. I wonder what we are not seeing in our own time that enslaved peoples in future ages will see with perfect clarity. What fractures are forming in the structures we believe to be stable? What certainties are we so wrapped in that we cannot perceive the way they are already beginning to break? The weight of the ghosts is not just the weight of what was. It is the weight of knowing what could be, what has been, what will likely be again, and the strange responsibility of having received a message we were not meant to receive, and knowing ourselves powerless to ensure it is heard. The Rakata left warnings for us, and they could not stop the Sith from using the Star Forge anyway, could not stop Revan from walking into the very doom they had tried to prevent. So the question settles over everything now, the way these calm questions do. If a civilization transcendent enough to reshape stars, unified enough to touch the minds of billions, powerful enough to enslave hundreds of worlds, could not prevent its own collapse or ensure that its warnings would be heeded, what makes us think we can? And perhaps that is the final unspoken warning the Rakata left us. Not that we are destined to repeat them, but that certainty itself. The absolute conviction that this time will be different, that we have learned, that we are the exception, is the exact thing that makes repetition inevitable. The ghosts are patient. They have been waiting 10,000 years. They can wait 10,000 more. And all we can do is hold the weight of knowing, and hope that somewhere, someone is listening in a way that matters, in a way that changes something. But I am not sure anyone ever is.